If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Rangers, hikers, and woodsmen, what is the strangest, most mysterious, or creepiest out of this world thing you've ever seen in the deep woods or forests? There are a ton of people who have mysteriously disappeared in Nahanni National Park in Canada's Northwest Territories, a place associated with all sorts of strange legends. The spookiest of these, in my opinion, is the disappearance of a Métis girl named May Lafferty in the summer of 1921. May was traveling with a band of Dean Indian hunters when she disappeared. That same day, 6 expert trackers, all of them in excellent physical condition, went to look for her. They found her trail pretty quickly and followed it into the woods. Along the way, the search party found articles of May's clothing hanging here and there on tree branches, as if she had stripped naked as she ran. The mosquitoes in that part of the country are absolutely brutal in the summer and might have literally eaten the hunters alive had they been similarly clad. However, May's little moccasin tracks continued on, winding up into the mountains. Eventually, the tracks stopped at the base of a cliff, which none of the hunters particularly wanted to climb. When the bravest of them did, however, he found May's tracks on a ridge above. The search continued. The hunters followed May's trail for 9 days before giving her up for dead. Today, her fate remains a mystery. I just started doing owl surveys for the Forest Service. This means going out into the forest after last light, playing an owl call, and just standing there for 10 minutes waiting for a response. You have a headlamp and a flashlight. You can see what you choose to see in front of you, but every time you move your head or hand, you cause the shadows to move in fear that you will uncover something that will freak you out. Therefore, it is usually best to stand in one place to calm your nerves. However, you have to get to the survey area first. So me and my partner were driving in the pitch black through these unpaved roads, moving slowly. All we see is the rough road illuminated in front of us and the occasional memory of a turn or landmark from reconing the roads during the day. I look to my side and see what I think is a stand of trees, only to realize a moment later that it is actually a tall bluff. I continue on, and I see a disused mattress on the side of the road. We are 5 to 10 miles from the closest town on Forest Service roads that no one uses. Further along, I see what I think is another turnoff with a stand of trees in the distance. At the edge of the turnoff are a few dented metal boxes at the turnoff's edge. Next to the boxes are 2 glowing objects. The lights begin to move as we pass. It's not movement from the wind. It's too bright to be a reflection from our headlights. All of a sudden I see the whole object lurch up with the 2 lights in the middle of it and realize they are eyes. The creature starts rising up towards the edge of the clearing. I can't believe what I'm seeing. It seems to me to have the body shape of a deer, even though my partner shouts out that it's a mountain lion. It starts rising into the air. What? Are my eyes deceiving me? I realize from the motion that there must be another bluff at the side of the clearing instead of trees. I keep driving, trying to hide my fear so my partner doesn't get spooked. On our way back, my partner asks if we want to go check out that clearing again. Nope. I don't even merit the question with a reply. Wildland firefighter with the Forest Service. Not my story, but from an old supervisor of mine that I believe completely. Setting is 2004 or so, Hell's Canyon area of Middle Idaho. His crew had been working all day on an emerging incident and were going to be working through the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, second in charge, effectively, he was out ahead scouting on an ATV or something. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time when a bobcat or lynx, it's been a few years since I heard it, appeared in the middle of the road but didn't run away as they usually would. Thing stands there for a good 10 seconds, screams at him, and scampers up a tree not 5 feet off the road. He finds this odd but not particularly unsettling. Just a half mile or so down the road, he finds a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land and no private structures should be there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight, and someone had done a good job of doing so. The door had been punched out and secured to a hole drilled into the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything getting in, or out. Peering through the hole in the door, he can see that everything in the house is messed up. This has him kind of unsettled, so he hops on his ATV and heads back up the road. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Right where the bobcat had been, there stands a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet. Just standing there. He yells at her, asking if she needs help. She just screamed at him, the same scream as the cat from before, and climbed right up the tree, faster than any human has a right to be climbing. Obviously, he nopes out of there as fast as he can. Unsure of who or what he just saw, he asks a local guy about the cabin. After asking around a little, A local Native American hears them talking and informs them that they saw a pumawa, excuse the likely butchered spelling. In effect, a skin changer, a warg. Now, I would not believe most people that tried to tell me that. But this was a serious man that did not duck around about many things. He was dead serious the 2 times I've heard him tell it, and I 100% believe he saw what he saw. I'm an avid hunter and have been for most of my adult life. A little backstory before this happened. I am a marksman and was a rifleman in the Army. I've been hunting off and on since I was 15 years old and consistently for the last 5 years. So I'm no stranger to the woods of West Tennessee and the sounds that are normal. I had taken my children's 410 single-shot shotgun out to do some squirrel hunting since it is a nice snack for me and the kids. It was about 30 minutes before the twilight part of dusk when I went to the woods behind the house. I had been out for about 5 minutes when I saw a squirrel jumping from tree to tree. I decided to follow it as I slowly eased the hammer back on the shotgun while shouldering it and taking aim. I fired just below the squirrel because, with me being 29 and using a youth model shotgun, I have to compensate for the difference in build that the gun is rated for. After I fired, I looked around the tree before making my way through the swamp area where it was. The swamp is only ankle deep, so no real worries, just annoying walking through leaf-filled water because you can't see the holes that may be there. As I walked towards the tree past the swamp is a small creek that is a little more than ankle deep but can be knee deep in areas. As I cross the creek, that's when things get weird. I walk to the tree and see there is no squirrel around the tree, not uncommon since this gun is made for a 10-year-old and I'm almost 30. As I started to wander around to see if maybe the squirrel was alive and crawling around, I heard my daughter scream. She yells loud enough to hear a mile away, but the kids and my wife are in the play area over 200 yards from where I'm at, so it's no surprise that I heard her. What bothered me was that I started hearing a humming noise and footsteps all around me. I'm pulling 360s and looking around as I draw my tourist judge from my pocket loaded with 410 shells. I then hear what sounded like my youngest son yelling yay like he does when he sees me. I lower my gun, thinking that maybe they are going to meet me at the edge of the woods. As I cross the creek heading back, I only hear the humming noise, so I call my wife, and when she answers, my first question is, "Where are you?" She replies, "We are at the play area." Why? My blood instantly runs cold as I bring my gun up. "Did you come close to where I am?" I asked. "We've been up here this whole time." "Why?" she asks. I tell her what's been happening over the last 2 minutes, and she starts worrying. "What are you going to do?" she asks. "I'm heading your way." I respond as I walk through the swamp and back toward the trail between my ponds towards my backyard. The humming noise has stopped since I left the swamp area, but as I walk toward my family, I heard and saw my son humming, the same hum I was hearing in the woods. I knew it wasn't him I was hearing in the woods. He is a very quiet child, and we were too far apart to hear him outside. I'm a firm believer in the paranormal and supernatural and wholeheartedly feel and fear that I was being called by a Wendigo. If so, I fear that I may be in danger for entering its territory and not staying in my territory. I have always been drawn to the wild. It seems like home, and I generally know my neighbors out there. I am not afraid to venture into the deep woods, even in the darkness. I love my woods. One sunny, weekday afternoon I had dirt biked up an old mining road. It gained a couple thousand feet from the valley floor towards one of the ridges of the Cascades. When the road gave out near the bottom of a high basin, I put on my backpack and started off cross-country toward the ridge. It was still heavily forested, old growth and old cut fading in another 1,000 feet into those scraggly, wind-blown ones near the top. About 20 minutes in and about a half mile up from me, near the tree line, I heard this thumping sound. It was very odd, so I stopped to listen carefully. It sounded like a big, solid branch was being whacked against a solid tree. I use the word solid because the hits were powerful. One or both of the pieces of wood were rigid and dry. The wood resonated and rang on impact as dry wood will. I couldn't get over the power though. It sounded like someone was swinging a 4-inch post. Weird, right? Well, it gets better. This someone sounded like they were trying to communicate. The thumping had a very complex and well-defined pattern. And here's the weirdest part. The thumping signal occasionally became very rapid, like what a drummer could do if they were noodling around with a stick, but I swear it sounded like a 4-inch post was being treated as lightly as a drumstick. I listened for maybe 5 minutes, just fascinated with this sound, this code, and the power of it. Then the drumming suddenly stopped. And I kind of woke up to the fear of this unknown thing out there. I had my pistol, my bear spray, and my knife. I really only fear cougars, and even then I figure they'll have a bad day trying to take me down. Still, the silence as I stared into the forest ahead seemed loaded, and I turned on my heels and left that valley. That place and that experience gave me the chills, and that high valley won't see my shadow again. I have read stories about some of the native peoples around here having valleys that they just wouldn't go into. I can now easily understand how these legends get started. When I was little, I lived with my grandparents on a small farm with nice woods behind them. I played in those woods from the time I was a toddler. Someone had let out their big ol' meat rabbits, or maybe they escaped, and they'd come to the property. Being a toddler, they stood about as tall as me. This was the 90s, and one of the movies I watched was Alice in Wonderland. I remember thinking, if Alice followed the big white rabbit into the woods, so should I. These were friendly big rabbits. They would sit and cuddle and get scratched while I fed them horse grain. Off I went, following them. I was hesitant, but I loved those rabbits, so I kept following. We got to the edge of the sort of cleared wood I was allowed to play in near our swampy ponds. I trailblazed into the woods, mostly walking through the shallow stream because I was too little to be able to stomp down bushes. The rabbits would stop and turn around to watch me follow. We finally got to a clearing, in the middle of heavily wooded forest. There was a tree that had been struck by lightning, and the way it fell and the bark that stayed made it look like a throne. I would stay down there and play while the rabbits played with me or just did rabbit stuff. I'd bring my toys down. I'd just hang out with them. Well, this went on for 3 or so years until I was 6 or 7. I'm assuming the rabbits passed away. My grandpa said one got hit by a car. Without the rabbits, I didn't go down in the woods anymore. And I honestly didn't think about it until someone reminded me about them years later, when I was 12. I decided I would go back down for old time's sake and just go into the woods to sit and think. It took me forever to get down there since my paths had overgrown, but sure enough my stump throne was there, and some old toy cars were at the base still. I was stoked to find that and sat down in my old spot. I can't remember why, but I decided it was time to go back up. I brought my little Hot Wheels to put them with the rest of my collection and was spinning the wheels as I walked back up and out of the woods. When I got inside, I was getting yelled at for disappearing. I thought I was just down there for 20 to 25 minutes, but when I looked out the window, it was pitch black out. I had gone down in the early afternoon. When I was little, I could always hear when I was being called, yelling for me, whistling, shooting over the hill, banging the cast iron together, etc. Apparently my dad and grandparents had been calling and searching for me everywhere for hours. They called all the neighbors to start a search party. My mom pulled up as they were yelling at me trying to figure out where I was, and she was in tears and pretty much collapsed, hugging and squeezing me to death. I was in the Army during Desert Storm days. I was an 11B2H trainer, and would go TDY, detached duty, across the country to train units up for deployment. 7 of the guys in my unit got tabbed to go run OPFOR against some Marines and Navy personnel who were setting up a field hospital. The place is populated now, but it was an old World War I post and pretty much out in the sticks at the time. The scenario was the Navy sets up, the Marines provide security, and they try to stop us from getting inside. We want to keep them up all night, so we probe around and make noise. Around 2 a.m., we're ready to infiltrate. The Marines have set up a bunch of ops along a ridge, and my job is to divert their attention while one element makes its way through some serious thickets and another just crawls right up to their lines. We were a little short-handed, so I had to go on my own. I start at the base of the ridge and make my way up. I'm known for being sneaky and silent, and they don't notice me. There's all kinds of forest debris on the ground, so it's really slow going. I'm about 3/4 of the way up when I hear it. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I think it's one of the Marines, and I've blown the approach, so I freeze. Then it goes again, scritch, 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 and then again. I'm thinking, WTF? It goes on like this for about 5 minutes, repeating every 20 seconds or so. It's pitch black, but it sounds really close. Then it shifts position, and I can hear leaves and twigs cracking. It sounds huge, and it's about 6 feet away. I think, oh duck, it's a boar, and drop my A2 with its blanks and miles gear and pull out my machete. It hears me, and boom. It stands up, more like leaps up. It was so fast. All I could see was a dark shape about 7 feet tall. Screw noise discipline. I yell duck. And it takes off running, heading to the top of the ridge. I lose sight of the shape pretty quickly, but the Marine ops see it and open fire. I slide on my ass back down the hill and hightail it back to the rally point. I have to wait, alone, for about 3 hours before everyone makes it back. I figured the noise I had heard was a deer or a boar rubbing its antlers or tusks against a tree. It was too big for a boar, so I told myself it was a deer. We get to the after-action review at about 7 a.m., and the Marine ops swear it was a big dude running across the ridge line. The captain makes me stand up to see if it was me, and they're all saying, "Nah, he's way too ducking small." They had night vision and swear up and down it wasn't a deer. I pocketed some live. 223 every time out after that. I was hiking with my dad in late September on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is usually when bears are fatting up for hibernation and most likely to be aggressive, and since we were a couple days walk from either trailhead and medical attention, we were on high alert. It had rained constantly, and we had only seen a single other hiker the whole time. He was traveling in the opposite direction as we were, he was heading north, we were southbound, and we had camped beside him 2 nights prior. So for the whole trip, the only tracks that we saw that looked remotely fresh were a single set of hiking boots coming towards us left by a pleasant and solitary German tourist, and we only observed them in places with extensive overhead cover. All other tracks were washed out and filled with rainwater due to the days and days of constant rain that was doing the best it could to duck up our vacation and make our packs even heavier. We were approaching a blackberry patch between ridges that hugged a small creek and smelled what we thought was a particularly stinky bear, and since the blackberries were on both sides of the trail with only about 3 meters between them, we had our heads on a swivel. There were no overhanging trees, as this particular berry patch was dozens of meters across and 2 or more meters high. My dad told me to hurry through as quick as we could and made a comment about how smart it was that we were wearing bear bells and how dangerous it is to startle a feeding bear. He was a couple meters ahead of me when I looked down and saw a footprint. It looked like an unchewed human footprint, except that it was 2 inches wider and at least 2 inches longer than mine, and I am 14 feet. It also had dermal ridges and only had a couple raindrops in it, so whatever made it had stepped there literally moments before. The scariest thing about it was that there were no other prints, so whatever had made that track had stepped out of the eastern side of the berry patch across the trail, 3 meters, and into the western patch in a single step. I was so startled I looked around as much as I could before my dad lovingly told me to hurry the duck up. And that was the only track there that wasn't now a small puddle, so before you discount it as a double-stepping bear paw print, where a bear's back paw steps into the print of its front paw, there is no way a black bear could have crossed the 3-meter distance without leaving more prints. Say what you want about bears, they are not at all graceful. There are also no grizzly bears on the island, and a cougar wouldn't have left a print that looked anything like that, even if it stepped in its own track. It also couldn't have been a hoax because a person couldn't just stand in the berry patch with a pole with a footprint on it, as they would be interacting with bears on a dangerously consistent basis. Also, why would someone sit in a berry patch in the relentless west coast rain in the hopes of pranking people that might not pass by for days? It doesn't really make sense to go to that much effort, risk that much danger, and basically swim in a lacerating blackberry bush for multiple days. I didn't believe in Sasquatch before that, but now I don't know what to believe. I was a service plumber for years, and that smell is still in my top 5 worst smells of all time. And I will never forget the image of the raindrops hitting that fresh track as I stared in disbelief. As I have been receiving multiple offers from different podcasts, I feel compelled to add this caveat. I don't now, nor will I ever consent to the publication of my story, and its reproduction or discussion in any form. Please respect my choice to speak with my own voice. My buddy was camping in northern Ontario about a decade ago. He and one other guy were involved. Everything was going great. They caught a bunch of fish and fried some up for dinner. They hung the rest of the catch in the trees for the evening. The sun was down, and they were relaxing. As they sat by the fire, they heard sounds coming from the bush. There were normal animal sounds, leaves crunching, twigs snapping. Easily a squirrel or raccoon. But there were also strange laughing sounds. My buddy looks in his periphery and sees what he describes as a little spider man. His camping partner sees the same thing, a little, human-like figure, like a hunched dwarf. They get spooked and run a few meters from camp. When they return, all the fish are gone from the trees. It only takes a few minutes for them to return. This, by itself, is not that scary. It could have been a raccoon, a porcupine, whatever. The eyes play tricks, and my buddy is a scientist, so he is not easily swayed by extraordinary explanations. Let's fast forward to when I was conducting research for my dissertation in the archives of Ontario. I came across an interview with early 20th century explorer Ernest Oberholzer. He recounts stories from his indigenous travel companion and guide, Atuk Kamau and Tatapaswerbeten or Billy McGee, who said the Anishinaabeg people north of Lake Superior spoke of Mishifisu or Mama Gray Sea, which were little people or dwarves who made strange sounds and played tricks on people. Same area my buddy was camping, similar descriptions. I immediately messaged my buddy. If anything, a fun story, but creepy if we let our imaginations run wild. Jack-o'-lanterns. I used to do wilderness forestry in the Linville Gorge area of North Carolina. A jack-o'-lantern is a disembodied light that floats in the air. They are commonly reported in the southern Appalachians, but reports are usually disregarded because it's easy to imagine that the person seeing them was seeing something more mundane. I have seen a few things that I suspect were jack-o'-lanterns, but there was one that was plain and clearly just a free-floating light out in the open on the east side of Shortoff Mountain, where there are no trails, in a place that can only be accessed by someone with good mountaineering skills and woodcraft. Furthermore, it was floating above a brush way too thick for anything to move quickly and smoothly through if it was walking on the ground. I should point out that there is a confirmed similar phenomenon nearby, the Brown Mountain Lights, that has puzzled people for centuries. On hot summer nights, you can sit at Wiseman's View or a pull-off on a highway east of the gorge and see jack-o'-lanterns dance along Brown Mountain Ridge yourself. This happened just months ago, and I still can't make any sense of it. My girlfriend and I were on a trip through some national forest land in Idaho. This place is familiar to us as we worked in the area and spent many summer days exploring the lakes, rivers, and forests in the region. Some of the best features in the area are a group of natural geothermal springs that bubble up from the ground in big, deep pools at a perfect hot tub temperature. We decided to visit these hot springs on a moonlit night. We have been there dozens of times, but never at night, as technically the place is a recreation site that closes at dark. The local game warden was known to bust people camping there. But as it was the weekend, the other springs in the area that were open at night were packed with people. So we decided to risk sneaking in after dark just to have it to ourselves. The first of many disconcerting things that night was the cross. At the trailhead, we saw a wooden cross made of sticks and twine erected on a pile of dirt. There were scraps of black plastic, like from a garbage bag, in the dirt, and it really looked like something was buried there. We joked about how creepy it was but decided to ignore it and head down the trail. The moon was out, and we walked without flashlights deep into the woods. The night was quiet and peaceful, and with great joy we arrived at the pools and stripped naked for a good soak. As we enjoyed the steaming pool, we felt romantic and amorous. We heard an ear-splitting boom. The noise was so loud that it hurt our eardrums and our heads were ringing. It was a loud, unfamiliar noise that sounded like an explosion or a car crash, and it sounded like it surrounded us and was far away at the same time. I thought it sounded like a giant metal door slammed as a grenade went off. My girlfriend yelled and grabbed me, hissing, "What was that?" All I could muster was, "I don't know, it sounds like a car crashed on the road." But inside I knew there was no way, as it was a 3-mile hike off the highway along a noisy creek. Then I simply said, "Get your clothes on, we are leaving." We noped the duck out of there, and I did my best to stay calm even though I was terrified. We did our best to not run and be careful in the darkness. When we returned to the trailhead, I noticed our truck was no longer the only vehicle in the parking lot anymore. A black truck was parked right next to us, and I assumed it was the warden, waiting to bust us for being there at night. As we got closer, I saw the truck had Montana plates and couldn't be the warden. There were 2 huge men standing there staring us down, and they didn't look friendly. One man locked eyes with me, so I said in my deepest manliest voice, "Good evening." To which he replied in a thick Eastern European accent, "Is there anybody out there?" I just said no, and we literally broke into a run to our vehicle and left. The drive back, my mind raced with questions. What was that noise? Why did it happen right after we had sex? Why didn't whatever made it appear or continue making noise? What the duck was up with the cross and the creepy Russian guys? I couldn't explain it to myself, let alone my still shaken girlfriend, and I didn't get much sleep. So to start off, I want to say I am a big believer in the supernatural, so I know a lot about what I am talking about. So I live in a small town in Wisconsin where things always seemed off, but I never thought much of it. So I live in the country near a big woods, not massive but big enough that something could be in there and never be found. I have been going into those woods for my whole life and never seen anything weird or unnatural. So today I was out in the woods exploring, and I was pretty far into it when I entered an old stream thing and followed it down into another stream. I started walking into some brush because I saw a broken glass bottle and went to investigate. As I was walking, I stepped on a small stick and broke it, and when it snapped, I saw a big figure, from my estimate, about 7 to 10 feet tall with gray skin and small patches of fur that almost looked like the fur was poorly suede and where hanging from it had antlers and a slender frame. It burst of running up a hill and made it up in like 4 or 5 steps. I only saw its back, but I knew what I saw. It was a Wendigo. I stood there in fear for like 5 minutes when she took off running back to my house. I will never go out there again alone or without something that I can set on fire with. I am still very scared. I was out with 7 friends in very rural Australia and had limited supplies after an incident back at camp. We were hiking to the nearest town by ourselves. A few hours into the hike, The darkness begins to set in. Despite the darkness, the stars are incredibly vivid and stunning. We kept following the small 4x4 trail we'd been on and came to a small clearing next to a small stream. We just sat down next to some rocks and drank a bit out of it when all of a sudden I got this weirdly nauseating butterfly feeling, like before you go on stage in front of a crowd or something. But it didn't feel bad or malicious. I asked the others, and they had it too, and that's when we saw it. A little bit further down the stream, there were hundreds/thousands of glowing orb things all in different colors, just pulsating, and we watched them until they gradually faded, finding it to be both strange and mesmerizing. Faded. And that's when it happened, that dread feeling like so many people described. I sat paralyzed in fear, too scared to move or I'd just die or something. I looked at my friend, and her face said it all. It was completely pale, and her eyes looked hollow. It was honestly manic. After that, in almost unison, we all jumped up and booked it out of there. I don't know what happened when those orb things disappeared, but it felt like the goosebumps lasted hours, and I felt cold as ice. It was 25-ish degrees Celsius that night. 2 of my friends and I used to be stationed at Ft. Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and we decided a Memorial Day camping weekend would be a good idea, so we took a trip up to Monjo Peak outside of Ruidoso, New Mexico. We planned to stay for 3 nights, the first 2 of which were very relaxing. On our first day there, when we were deciding where to set up our tent, we found loads of bones from various animals, not mounded up or anything like they were collected, just bones all around the campsite. The campsite had 5 places to pitch tents over about 300 square meters. We decided to pitch our tents on the highest point at the campsite, about 30 to 40 feet higher elevation than the parking lot. On the 3rd night, it was well after sunset when all the noise from the woods died out. I'm not sure how long it was silent before me and my friends broached the subject, but it wasn't lengthy after that the hair on the back of my neck started to stand, followed by goosebumps all over. I could see my friends starting to get jittery, and from one of the other campsites we heard their 2 dogs going absolutely apeshit. These were very relaxed and joyful dogs for the last 2 days. We had also made decent acquaintances with the couple with the dogs, and they had lunch with us on day 2. The other 2 groups that were camping at the same time had gone silent as well. The car was about 60 meters from our campsite, and we unanimously decided to go get our guns, our 15s and 9mm pistols. On our way back, we started to smell a rotting, fetid stench. I don't know if anyone has ever had to burn feces before, but it smelled like that mixed with death. It was cloying and felt like it was almost physical, it was so strong. We got back to our campsite and decided to post guard all night. 1 man up and 2 asleep, or at least resting. I volunteered for the first shift because I knew I wasn't getting any rest at all. We had plenty of firewood for the night, especially because we were leaving the next morning. I kept the fire blazing as much as I could because I figured that if it was some sort of animal, it wouldn't be too interested in messing with me. I kept my back to the fire so I could maintain good night vision. As you can see on the maps, the forest to the west of our campsite was pretty burned out, but what you can't see very well is the elevation change. Once you got into the tree line, it was very steep, not impassable by any means, but not somewhere you need to be walking at night. Behind the trees, I noticed a stark white shape. I shouldered my rifle, and it didn't move at all. I assumed it was a partially hidden tree behind another one. I started scanning the tree line with a flashlight because I felt the stench was stronger than it was before. As my beam passed over what I thought was the obscured tree, I saw an eye shine from the white shape, and as soon as I registered what I was seeing, it disappeared behind the tree. I debated investigating but instead just roused my friends, and we scanned together. When my shift ended, I took off my rainfly on my tent so I could see out if needed. I didn't see anything on my next shift, just the smell. In the morning, just before dawn broke, the smell seemed to recede, but only so much, almost like it left a scent as a warning, was the impression that I got. We broke camp and started packing up. About halfway through our breakdown, we saw the other 3 groups packing up as well. I went over and talked to the couple with the dogs, asking them if they saw anything last night or if their dogs calmed down after the barking stopped. They told me that even when they stopped barking, the dogs didn't sleep. They spent the night whining and growling toward the hill to the south. Maybe it'll provoke something I don't remember, but I doubt it. One thing I find fascinating is that eye shine doesn't happen with humans or primates due to the lack of a tapetum lucidum in our eyes. One of my hobbies is model railroading. Some years ago, back in the late 90s, I took to building a model railroad based around a small, short logging/lumber railroad that had existed in the northeast part of Georgia. The railroad itself had gone belly up sometime in the mid-1940s during the war, with the majority of the sawmill buildings and tracks being pulled up and used for scrap metal. What wasn't pulled up had been left to rot in place. Since most logging cars of the day were just wood frame structures, with only the trucks, wheel sets, and couplers being metal, I didn't expect to find that much. About 2 hours into mapping the old cuttings and bridge locations, I came to this branch line that curved off from the main. The branch wasn't on any of the maps I had, some of which dated back to the 1900s when the line was built, so naturally I became curious. Tromping along, I noticed that the rails were still in place, and while it was badly grown up and the ties rotted, it looked in generally good condition. About 1.5 miles down this branch, as I came around a group of trees, I came face to face with this old steam locomotive. The thing looked like it had been there for some years, at least 50, if not more. It was battered and severely damaged by the wildfires that run through that area from time to time. I took several photos from it and then headed home. The next day I went to a local railway historical society to ask them if they knew about it. Here's where it gets weird. Speaking with them, I was told that they had heard about it and wondered if I had marked on the map where it was. I show them and then get the photos developed. Not a single one that I took of the locomotive turned out. Those taken before it and after it were fine, but every single one of the engines itself was just black, as though the film had gotten exposed. The Historical Society never found the locomotive, and I, over the course of the next year, before I moved further south, kept looking for it. Try as I might, I could not find it, even following the railroad as I had before. It was almost as though the thing had never been there. Growing up in the woods and going camping, my family and I have our fair share of bizarre and scary stories. This one I just can't seem to wrap my head around, even to this day. My parents owned 35 acres of property in the deep Rockies, about 2 to 3 hours away from our home. We spent as much time as we could camping there, because we all loved it. It was secluded and beautiful, and we had a lot of freedom there as kids. My parents were both experienced campers and backpackers and had both grown up in the mountains. One day, we head up at night, arriving at the property around 9 or 10 p.m. We were all worn out and started to unpack the tents and other items from the car. The minute we get out though, we all get a strange feeling. It didn't feel normal or good. We had encountered wild predators at this point and knew the feeling of being watched. But this was like being watched from all sides. We also all noticed that there are no sounds. It is dead silent. Normally we would be hearing all of the insects and occasional owls, nighthawks, or bats. And just the general hum of a forest. Nothing. We all kind of laughed nervously and maybe mentioned a few things but got to work setting up our tents nearby. This is when the real strange stuff starts to happen. We begin to hear rustling in the branches around us, about 10 feet off the ground, it seems. It almost sounded like large creatures like monkeys or raccoons, jumping from tree to tree loudly. And many of them. I have never ever seen raccoons have the ability to do something like that, and these sounds were clumsy, unlike birds. It gets louder and louder and becomes extremely unnerving. At this point the tent is set up, and my parents put my brother and I in there, telling us to stay inside. They go out with flashlights, trying to make sense of this bizarre activity. As they are outside, we start to hear these bizarre calls. I have never ever heard anything like this before or since. Honestly, it almost sounded like humans were mimicking some kind of primate holler or screech. There was an odd human-like aspect to it. And it's like they are calling and responding to each other from every direction, along with the branches cracking and rustling. My parents come back to the tent and tell us they couldn't see anything at all. I remember how shocked and frightened my mom looked, and it scared me because she was a badass that would stalk bears to get a good photo. Both my parents were not easily frightened by nature, or at all. We are all huddled together in the tent, confused, scared, and unsure of what to do. The sounds are so loud, and everywhere it almost sounds like some crazy storm outside. Our dogs are cowered in between us all, totally freaked out. My dad decides to go out again, and I remember as he finishes unzipping the tent, the sounds stop. Just like that, in an instant. And the oppressive, weird feeling is gone. He and my mom go out again to investigate and find nothing, except fallen branches and some strange marks up high on some trees. They come back, talk us down, and somehow manage to get us to sleep. We still talk about it to this day. None of us knows what happened or has any explanation. Like I said, we had some crazy and strange things happen to us. But never anything remotely similar to what happened that night. So I was around 19 years old, camping with my buddy in the mountains of North Carolina. We had hiked a few miles up a mountain from a campsite his grandparents were staying in and made a little lean-to shelter off a big rock we found near a stream. This wasn't on any trail, we walked up through the stream. Everything was awesome, no worries at all. Flash forward to a little after midnight. It's so dark, you can barely see your hand looking up at the sky. The fire is nothing but coals, and I'm on the outside half of the lean-to, looking out into the woods. Then I see a light. Just for a moment, mind you. So naturally, I continue to watch that same spot. A few minutes later, I see it again, pretty much in the same spot. My first thought was we had somehow gotten up close to a road on our climb, and I was seeing some headlights through the trees. Well, I kept watching to confirm my suspicions when the light did some crazy flip maneuver. So either someone had a crazy wreck or it's actually someone with a flashlight walking around in the woods in the middle of the night. So I'm just frozen, staring off into the darkness, waiting for Hillbilly Joe to murder me, and my friend is just snoring gently behind me up against the rock. After about 10 minutes with no more sightings of any lights, suddenly a light appears at my feet. Out of nowhere. It was an orb, maybe the size of a golf ball. I've heard people say, oh, it was just a firefly, but it was white. Like perfect light? I'm still not sure how to describe it, but it didn't seem to cast light on its surroundings, it just was light. But it went from the base of our shelter, where my feet were, and moved silently in a perfectly straight line all the way past my head, then disappeared. I am literally frozen solid now. I couldn't move if my life depended on it, and for all I knew, it did. About 15 agonizingly long minutes after it scanned me, or whatever, it went back to flitting around near its original spot. However, now it wasn't going off, it just stayed on all the time. At this point, my friend rolled over in his sleep and was close enough for me to bump him with my elbow while not making any noise and keeping basically totally still. He was immediately awake and alert, thinking there could be an animal nearby. He leaned up on my back and peeked over my shoulder after I whispered, "Look in the woods." After a few seconds, I heard him whisper, "What the duck is that?" "Duck me, I'm not crazy, it wasn't a dream." We stayed watching the light dance around for a few minutes until he turned and looked up the hill from our shelter, and there were 2 more lights flitting around up there. We remained awake until the sun came up watching them. They stayed until about an hour before dawn. Once the sun was up, we passed out for a few hours and then packed our shit and left. We still don't have an explanation for what they could have been. Spirits? Ghosts? Aliens? Mutant fireflies? I will mention that when I finally fell asleep that morning when the sun rose, I had a dream reliving it. Except this time when the light scanned me, I sat up and said, "What are you?" At which point it went from its perfect white over to red and flew directly into my face. I woke up at that point. Phew, that was a lot to type. Does anyone else have anything like that? Summer camp counselor here. I work every summer for a camp for 5 weeks. One time, we were backpacking to the tallest peak in my state. To get away from the kids at night, me and a coworker/friend went on a night hike. We laid down on a slope in a patch of grass to stargaze, about a quarter mile from everyone else. As we were lying, I heard the beautiful sound of water behind me, and I mean beautiful. I've never heard water running before and thought to myself, wow, this sounds beautiful. All I could imagine was crisp, clear water gracefully trickling by. I had this image stuck in my head. I had a sudden urge to go find it. Not just an urge but a need to find the creek. Now behind us was dense forest and brush, so it would have been hard to find it at night, but it sounded somewhat close to us. Me and my friend looked at each other without saying a word. I knew he was having the exact same thoughts as me. I said to myself, let's wait for 5 minutes, then we'll decide if we should check it out or not. It felt like a playful presence was trying to persuade us to go over there. Then I decided we should go check it out, and we stood up without saying anything to each other. It just sort of happened. As we were approaching the sound, it became quieter and quieter. We stopped, not knowing if we wanted to continue. As we stood there, the noise of trickling water became louder and louder until it sounded like standing next to a river. I then said, let's come back tomorrow to find it, and we agreed to come back later. When I made that decision, the sound of the creek vanished, along with the urge to go. There was only silence. The presence I felt earlier suddenly became sinister. It was just this dark feeling of presence, kind of similar to knowing when someone is watching you. I felt this fear slowly creep up from my belly. We walked back to camp quickly without speaking. Once we got back, we started talking about what just happened. My friend had the exact same urge to find the creek and the same internal battle in fighting the urge to go look for it. When we got back, it was like a trance had been lifted, and only then did we realize that what happened was not normal. We both could think clear, like a fog had been lifted. That urge I felt did not feel like my own mind urge. It's difficult to explain. Like an urge placed there because once the sound of the water stopped, the urge stopped. The next morning we went back to the spot and went to the place where we heard the creek. We looked and looked, but we couldn't find any sort of creek or water. We later looked at some maps of where we were, and there are no creeks or water nearby. I'm scared to imagine what would have happened if we followed the sound of the water because of the ominous presence we both felt. If I was by myself, I would have thought I was imaging it, but my friend thought, felt, and experienced everything I did. I don't know what it was, but it was eerie, to say the least. What's strange is neither of us said anything to each other once we heard the sound of water, and yet we both made the decision to go look for it without asking each other, and both heard the sound of water becoming louder and quieter even though there was nothing there. We both felt the sinister presence trying to lure us in. I'm thankful we decided to go back later, all of it felt off. When I was 10 years old, we got a new puppy. He was a spaniel, the most social and friendly little dog. He would run up to people on the street and greet them with a wildly wagging tail and exciting little jumps. He never failed to greet a potential new friend. My responsibility was to walk him every day, usually in the afternoon but also the occasional late-night stroll. My favorite route was to take him through this little wooded area near our house. This wooded area lay behind the conservatoire and was protected from being cut down due to Siberian flying squirrels that inhabited the area. This tiny sanctuary had an artificial pond, murky, still water, and the occasional duck. It was customary for all new graduates of the conservatoire to swim a lap in the murky pond upon graduation day, a rite of passage of sorts. The area consisted of one path from one end to the other, the pond being near the southern entrance, and then another 500 meters of path after it in the woods. That particular night, in the dead of the Finnish winter, our poor puppy had tummy trouble, and Mom, exhausted from a day's work, asked me to take him outside one more time. It was already nearly midnight, but I agreed, seeing how all creatures should be allowed to use the bathroom when they needed to. I also love how the piercingly white snow glows in the night, how your breathing fogs up if it's cold enough, and a step on the snow makes it creak in a very satisfying manner underfoot. It was that kind of weather, so I put on my winter jacket and boots, and off we went in the pitch-black night. As usual, I steered our puppy towards the little wooded area, away from streetlights, as he pranced in snow, reaching up to his sides like an excited rabbit. He seemed all better, pulling me forward so fast I almost fell over in the snow more than once, sniffing every scent left by other dogs in the area with his tail pointing straight up in excitement. As we approached the pond, the cold air carried with it a peculiar sound. A very steady, very consistent thump, thump, thump. I was a bit confused, since usually this area didn't have much traffic during the night. An occasional fellow dog walker maybe, but seeing as how all the benches were covered in snow and the path was narrow, it wasn't exactly a spot to hang out in the middle of the night. As we approached the pond's opening, I found myself frozen. In the middle of the frozen pond sat a little boy. He was sitting on the ice that had been dug up from under at least a meter of thick snow covering it. He was wearing clothes that struck odd to me, no Gore-Tex, nothing modern. His clothes were all shades of orange and looked to be made from fabric instead of what kids in Finland wore, no colorful patterns, no reflectors. He was also wearing a fur hat and leather mittens. It reminded me of pictures of my mom as a child in the late 60s and her winter clothes. The thumping came from. This little boy, I'd estimate to be around 6 years old, was systematically and very rhythmically hitting a huge rock on the ice he was sitting on. The rock was way too big for such a small human to be lifting it, let alone smashing it repeatedly on the ice like it weighed nothing. My first thought was that it was just some kid from my neighborhood. But the longer I considered this option, the more ludicrous it seemed. The nearest houses were at least half a kilometer away, if not more. I saw no one else on my way there, no person that seemed to be watching over a child playing nearby. It would take a very uncaring parent to let a child out this late in freezing temperatures, all alone, knowing that there was a source of water nearby. There was no logical way this kid could be there, lest a very sad home situation. So I decided to save the day. I stepped off the path when the dog leash in my hand stopped me. Our dog, who would always and every time approach new people he met, was desperately trying to pull me forward in our route to sniff the next piss-soaked snowbank. He didn't even recognize the boy on the ice, his eyes didn't steer that way once. It's like I was the only one to actually see the boy. The boy didn't seem to notice me, either. He kept hitting the ice under him, thump, 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 completely oblivious of anyone or anything around him. There was a weird stillness in the air, all I could hear was the sound of this huge rock bouncing off the ice and occasionally cracking it. I could see the ice had already started to chip away to form a dent. He must have been hitting it for a very long time, since that pond usually froze all the way down to the bottom and ice during the winter months as tough as steel. I pulled my dog closer to the edge of the pond, almost holding my breath from anticipation, and the rush of saving a child made me swell with pride. "Hey? Are you okay? Where are your parents?" My voice was so weak, it seemed to be absorbed by the snow all around us. It was difficult to speak, It felt forbidden. Like any second, this child would just disappear into thin air if I broke the spell that was keeping him in this world. The boy paid me no mind at all. It's like he was stuck in a forever loop of hitting the ice over and over again, like he was just a mirage from another place and time. I started feeling more and more scared. It seemed that I couldn't form any kind of connection to this child, and I wanted to run. So that's what I did. The dog seemed happy to finally be on our way, as I hurriedly started running on the path to make it to the other end of the wooded area. Good thing our puppy loved to race and forgot the wonderful smells of the yellow snow in an instant, and all while I was running and slipping on the frozen overpath, all the way until I saw a streetlight shine its blissful light towards me and my oblivious galloping puppy. I could hear the perfectly rhythmic, hollow thump, 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 until it faded to nothing and I was standing there, out of breath, looking up and down the empty street, expecting anything to happen. I went home and told my mom what I saw. Of course she didn't believe me. But every now and then I wonder if decades ago, a little boy wearing a fur hat and a faded orange coat drowned in that pond on a cold autumn night and sank to the bottom, slowly suffocating in water where it hurts to touch it. I'm a freshly graduated high school student and on my way to college. During my senior year, I had a job working for my grandfather as a farmhand. Well, more or less a farm manager. He would give me instructions on what to do to the farm without him being there, most commonly feeding the cows. It was early November, and at this moment in time baseball practice started after school, and it would last from 3:25 to 5:30, and by that time the sun was almost down when I arrived at work and started getting ready. One day, I filled up the buckets and fed the first farm when I realized I didn't have a key to the other farm. Frustrated, I was forced to pick up 2 buckets at a time and walk them from the fence to the feed troughs, a good 40-yard walk. While walking, I was trying to keep myself upbeat and just started to whistle, no real pattern or tune but something that I came up with. And when I came back and put the last buckets in the bed of the truck, I heard something from my neighboring property. It was whistling. Strange, I thought, no one lives anywhere near that property, and it sounded very close. I rationalized it as a mockingbird or something and went on with life. The next couple days, I didn't whistle, but the whistling continued, and slowly over those few days it got clearer and clearer until it just sounded like regular whistling, and eventually it got louder. When I had first heard it, it was very faint. I almost missed it over the crunching of me walking to my truck. The last days in those few, I kind of became accustomed to the whistling and kind of expected it. And when one day it didn't come, I was a little disappointed. This time, I had brought the key, and I walked up to the gate and started fiddling with my keys when I dropped them into the grass. I said damn it when I dropped them. I squatted down and started to search for them when I heard a very faint sound coming from the other property. A low groan/gurgle. And it was getting louder. At this point I wasn't scared but more curious as to what was going on over there. I left my truck parked across from the property and walked a few feet down the road and hopped the fence to the property. I heard the sounds. The land in there goes straight uphill and is heavily wooded all throughout, and the further you go up, the more and more dense it gets. Looking back now, I made a few big mistakes that could have gotten me hurt. As I walked up the hill, I would occasionally hear the gurgle. It was far up the hill, so still as faint as it was before. As I walked, a foul smell started to hit my nose, a weird mixture of garbage and wet dog or something. I heard something as I was about to crest the hill, damn it. A very dry, low, and quiet distorted damn it came from a couple yards in front of me. It sounded like a 60-year-old smoker said damn it really slowly, and I automatically thought someone was on our property. Somewhat angry and paranoid now, I started to move slower. I didn't want this guy to hear me before I could see them. I kept going, and I stopped and listened when I heard another sound, damn it. Damn it. This guy was slowly saying damn it normally, not long and drawn out in that eerie way as if he didn't know English. I sat down on this log, sort of listening, trying to figure out what I should do about this person. He kept saying damn it over and over, and I noticed that his tone was getting higher and his inflection was changing, and it hit me, this guy was perfectly mimicking me. My tone, inflection, literally everything, he even mimicked my frustration when I said it. Pissed and kind of scared now, I got up and started to crest the hill. I flicked on my flashlight on my phone. Hey! This is private property. I was cut off mid-sentence. As I came over the hill, the light barely illuminated a naked figure squatting just a couple yards in front of me. His eyes were illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight. I automatically felt that something was wrong. This wasn't a regular person. His neck was longer than normal, and when I came up the hill, he winched and snapped his head to look at me without moving. His eyes were too big, and his head was large and slender. He was squatting down in a ballet-type squat. I looked at his body. He was very skinny, His ribs were visible through his skin. There was a short silence, and, like a robot, the man turned in the leaves and slowly stood with his hands next to his side. I was debating whether this was even a person. It was far too tall for a human. "Damn it," it said in my voice. I turned and I sprinted down the hill. It didn't feel like I was running, but more that my legs were just going through the motions. I didn't look back before I got to the fence, and when I hopped it, I got in my truck and sped away. Sadly, I still work at that farm, but I've never told anyone this story, not even my grandfather. Since then, I've only heard the whistling a couple more times. This happened to my friend, who was working as a police officer at the time. We shall call my friend Tom. Anyways, Tom had just begun working as an officer, and as a result, he got stuck with lousy shifts. Tom worked in a neighborhood where just about nothing bad ever happened, but working graveyard shifts at parks in the area can still be pretty creepy. Usually though, he would just find a couple stoners hanging out on a swing set. This one night, Tom had a shift at a local park he didn't often go to. It's about 2 a.m., and his only job is to just make sure no one is around and all is well. As he is walking around the outskirts of the woods, he sees one man just standing with his back facing him on the edge of the darkness of the woods. He yelled out to the man, "Hey, you, what are you doing? Come over here right now." The man turned and smiled at him. Then he dashed into the woods. Without really thinking, Tom sprinted after him. The guy was booking it, leaping over branches and ducking under fallen trees like a pro. Tom is an extremely athletic guy, but this man was on a different level. As Tom finally catches the guy, he again yells out to him. The man smiles once again, then books it once again. Tom kept after him but was always a good 10 to 15 feet behind this guy. Finally, they reach a clearing in the woods. Tom's adrenaline is running low, and it's taking all his power to keep screaming for the guy to stop. The guy turns and smiles once more. The guy books it over a hill, seemingly a step slower this time. Tom draws his gun and powers up the hill. The guy was gone. According to Tom, it was literally as if he disappeared. There was no way he could have escaped normally. To this day, Tom recounts it as an encounter with a very sinister paranormal being. I was part of a land management team that kept finding panther tracks in a remote area of Florida. Not completely impossible, because it was not far from known Florida panther range, but then we had some visual sightings, cubs, and year-round tracks, which prompted numerous denials on the part of state and federal wildlife agencies. Then we got trail cam photos, and they classified the animal as a non-viable hybrid. Ultimately, we got multiple casts and good photos, and it was finally established that yes, a reproducing Florida panther had set up temporary residence in that area. It's not a huge deal except that it opened my eyes to how insistent and purposefully ignorant government wildlife officials can be when confronted with information about protected species that doesn't exactly fit into their hard-won, heavily political recovery plans and critical habitat. The long-term implications of having the area where we discovered a reproducing Florida panther reclassified as critical habitat, which never happened, BTW, would have included land development restrictions to the tune of potentially billions lost by a land development group that entailed the governor at the time. My coworker who deployed the cameras was nearly fired because she had done it without proper authorization, although we use trail cams all the time for all sorts of reasons without asking. It was pretty disgusting, overall. My second favorite involves a nighttime sighting of an unknown bipedal, hairy ape-looking thing. I don't call it Bigfoot because, well, that carries a lot of unwanted or undefined implications when a scientist says it. However, if there were actual Bigfoots, this was probably one of them. I was driving along a gravel back road in WV prior to the construction of I-77 in the southern half of the state. This particular road eventually dead ends for all practical traffic purposes, but it actually just terminated, at the time. Now there are a few houses and fences, at an old log landing site, from which various trails diverge to the south and west, generally downhill from the large plateau that Beckley sits on. At the time, the nearest houses were about 9 miles to the east, where this road connects with US 19, or about 6 miles as the crow flies. To the west, there were about 20 miles of mostly uninterrupted forest with only a few very rough 4WD drive trails in between. It was just after dusk and snowing, and I was heading east from the dead-end area during a brief visit to the general area, where I had been scouting for a potential place to do some black powder rifle hunting, that is a limited, late winter season for hunting white-tailed deer with primitive rifles, a wonderful excuse to spend time alone in the woods when it is blue cold and few others venture out. So as I rounded a small bend in the road, my headlights swept across the road and illuminated this thing just casually strolling across. I was already creeping slowly because of the snow cover, The entire encounter lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds. It slowed in the middle of the gravel road, looked towards my car, which was about 50 or 60 feet away, and then carefully strolled on into the dark woods. It was so unexpected that I drove on, trying to figure out a way to explain it to myself, trying to remember some visual or detail that would confirm an ID as a bear or human or something that made sense. About a half-mile down the road, it dawned on me that I had seen one of the strangest things I would ever see, and I turned around and went back to the area. This was during the early days of flip phones, and I had no flashlight or cell coverage there. I stopped with my lights shining into the same section of road for a while to see if anything showed itself. Then I got out my flip phone and searched for tracks. I saw general track shapes, but it was too dark to see any detail or get a photo. I left, and it snowed all night, and when I went back the next morning, there was absolutely no sign. I've been back to the same place dozens of times since then. Haven't seen it or anything like it since. It really bugs me. I believe I was near Hendy Woods, Mendocino County, California, in 2001. I was a trip leader for a small backpacking club, and our group was having a staff retreat. It got dark, we had a campfire going, and everyone was having a good time. It was a semi-official work function, and there was a zero-tolerance policy for drugs/alcohol. I was 100% sober. It's a pretty wooded area, lots of trees, no nearby lights or cities, street lights, moonlight, etc. dark other than the campfire and flashlights. One of the trip leaders, fairly big dude, experienced backpacker, goes out into the forest to take a piss and comes back a few seconds later screaming. I don't remember exactly what he said, as this was over 15 years ago, but something along the lines of "it's so big." At first we think he's joking. Oh my god, my trouser snake is so big. It was a co-ed group after all. After seeing him run back with pure terror on his face, we start taking him seriously. The "it's so big" scream was in reference to the size of footfalls he heard in the forest nearby. We all get quiet by the campfire, flashlights out. At this point, I hear noticeable footfalls a little bit beyond where our campfire light extends. It sounds bipedal, as opposed to some four-legged animal. It also sounded large, not earth-shaking, but bigger than an average human. Twigs snapped in the distance, so whatever it wasn't trying very hard to conceal its presence/stalking us. I didn't think much about that at the time. I was just trying not to completely freak out. I could also hear breathing, slightly wheezy, coming from the direction of the footfalls. Pretty freaky. The footfalls start going away from us. Relieved that we are not apparently on some large creature's dinner menu, but not confident this episode was over, we wanted to make sure we wouldn't be in danger again later. One of the trip leaders was ex-military, so he asks us for weapons. I have a pocket knife, so I offer it to him. He and one other trip leader get the best flashlight and my pocket knife and try to figure out what the AF that thing was. We watch their flashlights grow more distant as they try to track that thing down. I'm ashamed to admit that I was a little concerned that I might not get my pocket knife back, which makes me feel like a bit of a douche in retrospect. Thankfully I kept that concern to myself at the time. We yell at them to come back. No response. Search party number 2 starts to assemble, which consisted of myself and another unarmed, non-combatant. As we start heading in the direction of our lost compatriots, we see their flashlights headed in our direction again. They're in no rush. They tracked it for a while but eventually lost it and didn't feel like getting lost in the woods, so they turned back. We went back to the campfire, I got my pocket knife back. It may not matter to anyone else, but I really like that knife, still have it to this day. Eventually we all got tired, went into our tents, and actually got some sleep. There were some theories about what that thing was: drunk, asthmatic Sasquatch, the ghost of the Hendy Woods hermit, mushroom-tripping cow that decides to two-leg it for a while, but no one actually saw it, so the mystery continues. Most people I tell this story to probably think I'm just making this up. I'm guessing there will be a fair amount of skepticism here as well. I don't really care, I know what I heard, and I don't care about convincing anyone. I'd probably discount this story if it hadn't happened to me as well. I don't think the 15 or so of us who lived it will ever forget it. I was on a canoe trip in Canada, in a very remote part of the Boundary Waters. One might say that after dinner we had some free time, so I decided to go on a hike and explore the area around the island. I did this every night because I like to know the layout of the area. I was alone, I know, but had a flashlight, whistle, compass, knife, etc., and everybody knew where I was headed. I also made sure to stay where I could see the campsite, which was still pretty far because I was going uphill. It was pretty dark, but not pitch black. Dark enough to necessitate a flashlight in some places. Anyway, I eventually reached the top of the hill, where it got pretty flat. I decided to keep going until I could see the water on the other side. The campsite was on a peninsula of an island. I wouldn't be able to see the campsite, but I thought I wouldn't have to go far, so I went anyway against my better judgment. Well, it was farther than I expected, but I figured, well, I've already gone this far, so duck it. I climbed an oak tree to see how far the water was. I could see it just barely, but I also saw something more interesting than the water. There was a small spring-fed pond about 100 feet away, with a little creek running from it. I decided I would go see it and then turn back, especially because I should have been back already, and it was getting dark. So I went to the little spring pond thing. The first thing I noticed was that it was strangely cold. The air was still, it was just a weird atmosphere. As soon as I was in the clearing, I had a strange feeling of dread in my chest. I felt scared and nervous. So I looked around. It was about 20 by 10. There were no plants or trees for about 10 feet from it in any direction. The only thing was a big dead oak tree. It appeared to have been struck by lightning, as it was burned and cracked down the middle. How a tree that got struck by lightning looks. It had fallen over, creating a cave hole where the roots used to be. So anyway, standing right in front of the hole, facing the pond and me, is a creature. It looked almost exactly like a wolf, but it stood on its hind legs, standing almost as straight as a human. It was easily 6 tock standing. Besides its posture, the only thing human about it was its hands. They looked kind of like human hands, but with pads and claws like a dog's feet. On its head were some horn/antler things. They looked like either deer antlers or ram horns. It had dark silver eyes. And it was staring right at me. I made eye contact and instantly felt that I was going to die. I know this sounds cliché, but I felt frozen, staring into its eyes. And then, as I looked into its eyes, it seemed to talk to me. It wasn't moving its mouth, and the words didn't sound like any language I've heard. It sounded almost inhuman. But I could tell it was speaking. It spoke for about the length of a sentence, and as it finished, I unfroze. I turned around and ran back the way I came, and maybe 100 later, when I turned around, it was gone. Not by the pond, not chasing me, and nowhere to be seen. It was gone. I could feel it, that it wasn't chasing, watching, or stalking. I continued running all the way back to camp, crying, and went straight to bed with my knife next to my pillow. The next morning, I woke up as soon as the sun rose, cooked breakfast, and began to break camp by myself as fast as I could. We were gone in less than 45 minutes, and I pushed everyone to keep paddling as long as they could. I just wanted to put as much distance between me and that thing as I could. The rest of the trip went beautifully. I really enjoyed myself, and nothing went wrong, but I still had a small feeling of dread, fright, and anxiety, the same I felt near the pond. Ever since, I've told one person. I still have no idea what it was or what happened. In the late 80s, I was in my early 20s, and 2 friends and I went camping in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at that time, so we were able to camp for free in other parks in the state. Both of us had done a lot of camping before. Me, I grew up camping with my family on every single vacation, all over the state. For the other friend with us, this was her first camping trip ever. We were camping in the youth area, which was empty that weekend but quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. Later in the afternoon on the second day of our trip, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite, being within shouting distance but enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then I'd kind of feel like someone was watching me. I'd look around, see and hear nothing, then shrug it off and go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site about a quarter-mile away came over with a truckload of firewood and a 6-pack of beer. We all sat around talking for a while. Well, after dark, we could suddenly hear what was probably a bunch of teenagers fooling around on one of the trails a couple miles away. Since the trails were closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden I had a cold chill go over me, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and out of nowhere I was terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't say anything to my friend, I didn't want to scare her. Then I glanced over at her just as she glanced at me, and she said, "Do you feel that?" I said, "Yeah. I think maybe we'd better go to the car." We both felt like we were in deadly danger, but no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. Then halfway to the car we looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in, locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. I sat there with my pistol, feeling like it was totally inadequate for whatever was out there. We both just sat looking straight ahead. We were afraid to look around. I had the feeling at one point that if I turned my head and looked out the window, I'd see something that would drive me insane. I don't know how long we sat there. It was probably just a few minutes, but it felt like forever. Then it just disappeared. We could actually feel it going away. A few minutes after that, the other two came back in the truck. We kind of laughed it off afterward, but I'll tell you, I've never been that scared before or since. I've faced a lot in my life, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced we were in terrible danger. A few friends and I had a long weekend, 5 days, off from school, and we decided to go camping in the North Georgia mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent. There were 5 of us, 2 guys, 3 girls, and loaded up my buddy truck. He and I had some experience being outdoors / camping / hiking / hunting, and he's an Army vet, so we packed really well and had all sorts of amenities, like a propane stove or grill, fold-up cots, and a portable shower. We were in IT for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 to 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a big pond / tiny lake in it. We stepped into the open area, and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around, even the clouds and wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I both thought, well, SHT, there's got to be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns. It's the law in Kennesaw, just in case. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured it was a mountain lion or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking around the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing just at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed she must live somewhere nearby, so we continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder at where she was standing, but she was gone. Once we got into the trees, the forest sounds returned. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that as it was getting late and we didn't want to be stuck building camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked and set up and built a fire. Popped a couple beers and sat down to hang out. There was a girl I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing, it just got really quiet." We both quickly dressed and headed back outside to the fire. The others hadn't noticed anything strange and didn't mention anything wrong except joking with us that it took us a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on but not ignited and had gone empty overnight. None of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt was left on a little folding chair / stool. We figured we just misplaced things, or someone had used them and put them somewhere else. During the second full day, Friday, we were looking for a waterfall that we read online was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up to the top of a hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman. Same clothes and all. Just standing. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us or not, but she was just standing there. My buddy informed the girls that he thought he saw a mountain lion following us and was going to scare it off. He hustled up the hill, making a lot of noise, and came back about 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls but told me aside that the woman wasn't there when he got up there. We found the waterfall and put it out of our minds as the girls decided to skinny dip in the river, and titties can solve anything. We hiked back to camp and found it a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear something had gotten into our stuff. We told the girls that it was probably raccoons. We both went to bed with our guns. That night, SHT went sideways. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm. We had been sleeping cuddled up together. I opened my eyes, and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent, and my buddy was sitting halfway up, looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2-ish hours until the sun started coming up and then packed our stuff and we all headed out. The entire hike back into town was eerily silent. There were a couple points I thought I saw the woman through the trees but never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely and got back to the truck in what seemed like half the time it took to get out of the camp. After we were safely on the road back home, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone about moments they thought they heard / saw the woman all weekend but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The wild part was none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it was blurry. Went camping maybe 5 miles off main route here in local woods, just packs, food, drinks, and fire starting gear, 4 of us. It was around 11 p.m. when a friend of mine said he was going to walk alone back to the cars, take his, and go get more drinks. The only place open to sell them would have been like 15 to 20 miles away, 24/7 stores. We all agreed don't bother because of how late it was, but he left anyway. I gave him a powerful maglite, and off he went. About 30 to 60 minutes after he left, the noises started. It sounded like a cross between an injured bear and a person pretending to be Bigfoot or something. Figured it must have been said, "Friend." We all called out to him, no response, no more noises. Another 15 minutes pass, figure he either really left or passed out in the woods, so the remaining 3 of us go to check on the cars and make sure he made it to them. All we had was one bad lantern and a phone light to guide us. After about a mile or so, we heard the noises again, called out, got no response, but we heard the sounds of branches snapping and rustling towards our camp. We decide that one person will head to the cars, and the other 2 will return to the camp. I ended up being one of the 2 headed back. Friend 2 took the lantern, and we walked back just using a bit of moonlight and a phone. We walked for a mile but didn't see our campfire, but we could smell the smoke. After about 10 minutes of looking, we found the ashes. It didn't burn out, it was smothered with water, but not by us. Before any Smokey the Bear speeches, we took care to build a rock barrier around it and didn't put it out to locate it later. Enough to say, we were freaked out not having seen anyone else out there. We couldn't start a new fire, so we decided to cut and run and loaded our stuff, except for one item. I will explain that later. Hiked for about a mile until we roughly hit the spot where we separated from friend 2 and heard those noises again, this time much closer, right behind us. Time to dash, we thought. For about 2 miles anyhow, I couldn't handle more than that. I'm a bigger guy, pure fear got me 2 miles even. We only went back to walking when we hit a trail, not just cutting through forest. We felt safe, knowing that the cars would be in sight any moment now. We got to where the cars were parked, and something seemed weird. 2 of the 3 cars were missing. Friend 2 had left in his car, we had no idea why. We loaded up and hopped into my car, went to leave but noticed the car was leaning, got out, checked the tires, and noticed a knife dug into one tire. My knife, I pulled it out, realizing that it was mine, checked, and noticed mine was gone. Duck this, we started walking down the highway, still in the deep woods, towards town. Friend 1 saw us, picked us up, and we left. I came back for my car the next day. Finally, we got everyone together and discussed the night. Friend 1 left as he said, got drinks, flirted with the cashier, and picked us up, friend 3 and me, as described above. Friend 2's story is what freaked us all out. He said he heard the noises right around the time we split up, and he went to go back to the cars, turned, and in the distance saw a human outline standing there, watching him, holding a small knife. They stared at one another for about 30 seconds before the figure started to dash at him. He popped into his car and bolted. I don't know who to believe except for what I've seen, but I haven't camped in those woods yet. Who knows how many times we've gotten within feet of this supposed 5th person. Duck. I had moved to Southeast Washington for work after college. The Blue Mountains were very close by, and being a hunter, I was very interested in learning the land for hunting season. I went on several solo scouting trips into various areas, always picking locations that would put me the farthest from any public road or access point. I find that most hunters are too lazy to venture far off the roads, which results in less competition in the remote areas. Being outdoors has never been anything new to me. I grew up on a farm and ranch in Montana and have spent most of my youth working outside and dealing with animals. Not only would I have to tend to the various livestock, but I was raised into hunting and, above all, enjoy calling animals. I was 10 when I fooled my first coyote that I was a dying jackrabbit, and since then I have mimicked everything from rodents to bull elk well enough to fool predators and big game routinely. I know with the explosion of bow hunting popularity that animal calls have become more commonplace, but I don't think you can appreciate it to the same extent a country boy can that learned how to echo back the calls of cattle, horses, chickens, etc., before old enough to attend school. I'm not bragging here, I'm just laying the groundwork that I have a very trained ear for animal calls. So I set out one afternoon to run up the blues to scout for a game. I started late, but it wasn't a major concern because most animal activity is spotted during the early and late hours of the day. I was able to only hike a couple miles from the road before I needed to find a spot to camp and watch for game. I climbed up a ridge and found a small, somewhat level spot to set camp. I had a pretty good view of the surrounding area but ended up only seeing a couple whitetails before dark. I kept a dry camp, no fire, and just turned in early for the night to get a good start in the morning. I was awoken at about 1 a.m. to probably the worst headache I have ever had. It would be just a surge of pain, then taper off, then come back. I was very careful about my hydration during the pack-in, so I knew it wasn't dehydration, about my only real concern on the trip. So I'm lying in my bivvy with this on again, off again pulse of pain, trying my best to diagnose the cause when my ears finally tune to this strange sound coming from the mountainside above me. My thoughts move from the headache to this animal call. It's not matching any of the calls I know. It's not matching any of the general patterns I know. It's too loud and repetitive, it's unique, it's very, very strange. I know instantly that this is a large mammalian call. You can say, how do I know that? And all I can say is I have a lifetime experience like I stated above. It's definitely a mammal, it's big, with a deep, hollow vocal chamber, and although this is evident, I tell myself it is likely some WA bird to ease my mind. After all, Washington must have different birds than Montana, so now I'm stuck because if I focus on the sound, I can't believe my bullshit that it is a bird, and as soon as I try to not think about the sound, the surging pain of my headache is unbearable. Close to 2 a.m., I make a judgment call and pull camp and head back to the truck, with this call repeating the whole time before this decision. The way I hiked to my camp was pretty direct but rough, however, there was a gated road just above it that circled back to the main road where my truck was parked. Distance would be longer to follow the road, but easier to travel in the night. Also, it led me directly towards this call before it would start to circle back to the truck. So with my 1911 in hand, I walked that road out. The interesting part is the sound stayed above me as I walked out, always directly up the mountainside, and after climbing up to the road, only maybe 200 to 300 yards distant. The animal clearly shadowed my departure, following me up the mountain a ways. As soon as I dropped down out of the mountains, my headache completely cleared. I have since decided this was likely attributed to altitude sickness, since I was also having a hard time regulating my breathing. The real fun came when I got home and had to start searching bird sounds for Washington, at this point about 3 to 4 a.m. My search was not producing anything close to what I had heard. That small nagging voice finally had me online search Bigfoot call, and damn if I didn't find an audio file of what I had just heard almost instantly. That call was so unique that on my drive home I grabbed a mouth reed and was able to duplicate it quite quickly. There is no doubt in my mind about what I heard. Of course I have doubt of any sound on the internet labeled Bigfoot whoops, because who can say what call a mythological creature really makes, and how could you ever be sure? I can say that I never heard it again, even on return trips to that area. I even walked through the area it originated from, and it was a thick, nasty north slope face full of trees and vegetation. Earlier this summer I was hiking in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. A couple days into my trip, I got really sick. Sore throat, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite, about the worst cocktail of symptoms for hiking long distances. I had found a tick on me, and I was terrified that I might have Lyme disease. I decided to get off trail and see a doctor, which is easier said than done in the most remote, inaccessible section of the whole Appalachian Trail. Thankfully, there are old logging roads that crisscross the wilderness, so I decided to turn off onto a road that, I was told, led to a campground. There, I hoped to meet some day hikers and get a ride into town. As soon as I turned off the ad, it started pouring rain, which only increased my misery. A few minutes later, I noticed a dog in the woods. Strange, I thought. Then I saw another dog. And another, and another. About a dozen big hunting hounds, fenced off, randomly in the middle of nowhere, Maine. They barked at me, slavering, and pawed at the chicken wire fence, which did not seem strong enough to contain them. This was slightly disconcerting, but the brown trouser moment came when I spotted a lone figure in the woods, what seemed like a tall man in a hooded blue rain jacket and pants. I couldn't see his face, and he just stood there, still as a statue. Severely spooked, I hiked out of there on the double. In the backcountry, it's generally good manners to say hello and exchange pleasantries, but this guy didn't say a word. Maybe it was because of the rain, or maybe he was feeding bodies to his hounds out there, I may never know. But he definitely saw me, and I could tell that he was watching me go past. Jesus Christ, it's 2 a.m. here, and even though it's thousands of miles away, it still gives me creeps. A year ago, my grandfather in Malaysia died. Malaysian tradition is that you have to look over the body at all times until it is buried or cremated. I think that this was to stop any evil spirits from posing the body. Now, my grandfather was, literally, a bad man. He was a pretty powerful member of the trades back then and got most of my uncles into it. He was a great family man though, and he treated all of us with kindness and respect. His body was in his house, which was basically bordering a forest. Now, as he was a triad chief, there were over 50 armed men there and a lot of relatives either sleeping in the house or in the massive lawn. All the forest had in terms of wildlife were snakes, monkeys, and wild boars. Nothing too dangerous or scary. Or so I thought. The day after we first arrived, some of the men found a monkey on the outskirts of the forest. Dead. Its stomach had been completely ripped open, as had its face. I'll never forget its face. It had such a human look of terror that it will haunt me forever. The really creepy part was that there was barely any blood on the ground where it was. That meant that someone or something had killed it somewhere else and placed it there for us to find. That night, I drew guard duty for the night. This basically meant that I and some other men had to babysit my grandfather's coffin. Creepy, right? Anyway, that night was weird. Like all forests, you'll get noises like monkeys screaming, bird calls, etc. It was completely goddamn silent. It scared the shit out of me. Heck, it scared the guys who I was with, who were armed literally to the teeth and were probably serious criminals and maybe murderers. At around 3 a.m., these two guys wanted to go outside for a smoke. I was kind of bored, but I decided to join them. I remember before I left, one of the older men there called me over and handed me A.22. He told me that the forest doesn't seem right tonight, to be careful, and that it was loaded. I had learned to shoot before, but this was only my second or third time that I had handled a gun outside of a shooting range. So I walked out into the quiet night with these two guys. There were actually a few people around, but like us, they were kind of freaked by the forest. Anyway, I was walking slightly behind them, a rifle hanging on my shoulder and a torch in my hand. When I heard the noise, they were just shooting the shit and lighting up. It sounded like a huge man was running through thick branches, but it seemed to be coming from the trees. I ran up to the guys, and they had heard it too. These tough gangsters looked like pedos on their first day in general pop of a prison. One of them, white-faced, pointed at a spot high up in a tree. This thing was standing up on a branch. It looked like an orangutan, with really long hairs and stuff, but it was standing completely upright. It was also enormous. More than 6 feet at least. But its eyes. I'll never forget its eyes. They glowed a dull red, and the longer I stared at him, the more depressed and sad I became. I had an urge to walk into the forest and leave everything behind forever. I had taken a step forward when one of the guys started shooting. He was crying, chanting Buddhist verses, and basically screaming at the thing. I don't know whether he hit it or not, but the thing just vanished. We hightailed it back to the house, but we never saw it again. When we told everyone what we saw, they just became really quiet and refused to talk about it further. My mom and I left that afternoon. Later, I learned that the two guys had died quite recently. One was gutted in a street fight with a rival gang, and the other hanged himself. Although I haven't been back to that place since that happened, I always hear stories about how that place doesn't feel right and that occasionally a dead animal will turn up in the front yard. I have many strange stories as I spend a lot of time in the wilderness, often alone, but this one just happened a few weeks ago and was absolutely crazy. I am typing with chills running through my body and goosebumps even thinking about it. I like to camp at a lake in northern Arizona that is rather remote. My favorite spot is on a finger bluff, with cliffs on both sides and a lake, creek, and rich wildlife zone below. This area is home to the most wildlife in Oz. Elk, deer, bear, wildcat, wild turkey, porcupine, etc. A few times at this site we had headed off for day hikes or to go to a lookout point and returned to camp to find a pungent stench hanging over the site. I would describe it as a mix between a cow/horse stable and horse sweat, like when you take the saddle off on a hot day, with a little bit of skunkiness. I know what elk and bear smell like. I can't explain the smell. This happened multiple times on different trips, and the strange part is that the smell is gone within a minute or two of us returning to camp. Anyway, a few weeks ago, my good friend and I decided to go camping at that spot last minute on a whim. I needed to spread some of my dog's ashes in the area. We started packing up at about 7 p.m. Friday and were just getting into the off-road section by around 2 a.m. It started snowing, nearly blizzard conditions once we got off-road. It was so bad that we had to go about 10 miles per hour because the snow was blowing sideways and we could not see to navigate. It was sticking and getting deeper by the minute. We were going rather deep in and doing some serious 4x4ing. We knew we may be stuck at the spot for a few days, but we had what we needed. We arrive at camp at about 3 a.m. and get our tent set up. The snow has stopped now, and we are standing in a winter wonderland lit brightly by the moon. We decide to walk 30 or 40 feet out of camp to the cliff edge to look at the lake before bed. The lake tapers into a creek and lush wildlife zone about 1,000 feet below us. This is Oz, so to see the lake in the snow is a real treat that I hadn't experienced before. We are standing there in complete eerie silence, the kind that you only find in the snow, admiring the beauty of nature and talking about how lucky we are to be there while sipping our beers. We noticed the echo off of the opposing cliffs in the silence about half a mile away, so naturally I let out my best rendition of a Bigfoot/war cry. My buddy follows suit. We both get a few out when mid-war cry my friend is cut off by a blood-curdling manimal scream from back behind us on the other side of camp, maybe 200 feet away. There is an extremely rugged cliff on that side leading down to a creek/marsh area. I have heard elk as well as wild turkey call from that area. Now, here's where my hair stands up as I type. Before we can even process what we just heard, something huge and heavy jumps into the lake/creek directly below us with a loud thump and splash, as if someone did a cannonball, then bobs back up to the surface. There is a delay, and then something starts kicking and splashing violently, swimming across the water toward us. You could clearly hear the legs kicking like a human, very powerfully. You could hear the concussion in the water with each kick. Splash, splash. It sounded like a 500-pound man who is a poor swimmer, fully clothed with boots, swimming. There was no delay in any of the actions. It was very deliberate and obvious that it was coming directly toward us. The splashing continues for a few moments, then we hear it reach our side of the water, and without any delay, you hear the dripping and the river rocks clinking as it gets out of the water and immediately starts smashing through the brush toward us at a constant pace. At this point we are looking at each other and can't believe what's happening. My friend already had his pistol holstered on his belt, but mine was back at the truck. Braking limbs soon gave way to the sound of something scrambling over boulders as it made its way up the hill toward us. We stood there as long as we could, until it was obvious it would be closing with us in a minute or less. I was no longer comfortable being there unarmed, so we both bailed back to camp to get my gun. We stood around for a while longer in complete silence, trying to hear anything, waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened, and we headed to bed around 4 a.m. The rest of the trip was uneventful. What animal, at 3 a.m., just after a blizzard, with a few inches of snow on the ground, jumps completely into freezing water and moves directly toward humans screaming loudly in the night? That is what I want to know. I can't explain it. My only explanation is that maybe if a predator was chasing something that could explain it. But why would it run up a nearly vertical 1,000-foot hill/cliff toward shrieking humans? It would be the hardest, slowest route for it to take to escape a predator. That also doesn't explain the other scream/howl we heard or why this thing sounded obviously bipedal. The area is extremely remote, and any human or hoaxer would have been in an immediate survival situation after going in that water. I grew up in Belgium, Europe. Since I was young, I have been with my friends in the Scouts. It is mixed in Belgium. We do not have boys and girls apart usually. We start Scouts when we are 6 years old, and then we go through all the groups until we are 18, that is when we become Scout leaders usually. I am saying this to give you a little background on me and my friends. We are people who I would consider close with nature, camping, and overall used to a lot. I would not say we are your typical rough outdoors lumber type of person, but we can manage ourselves well through a forest. Back when we were around 16 years old, one of my friends invited our group to go wild camping in the forest that we have close to our homes. It is not your average American national park, I wish, with stories of Bigfoot or worse, but it definitely has its own charm and legends. We got a centuries-old tale about werewolves in our forest and a couple of legends about witches. It is not a huge forest, but one can get easily lost if they are not familiar with its trails, and all the trees look the same. This being said, to describe it the best I can, we were very familiar with the forest since we were small children playing in the tree line and afterwards as teenagers being blindly dropped with nothing but a map in the middle of it by our leaders. I do not know whether this game is popular in other countries in the Scouts, but in Belgium it is very well known and quite safe actually. We do not have bears or, until a year ago, wolves, and when dropped we would carry lights so just in case anyone didn't manage his or her way out, they would get spotted easily by a searching party. Again, this is not a national park that is so huge a person could go missing for days. That being said, again, we were very familiar with the forest, and we were all locals from the village nearby. So we started our camping journey with our bikes from the village to the entrance of the forest, and once there we would continue to the deeper parts of the forest on foot since it was an area with lots of hills and few trails for bikes. The mood was good. It was a beautiful, though slightly cold, autumn evening with few clouds and a beautiful sunset. We hiked our way through the forest until we got to a small clearing with some grass and prepared our tents for the night. We made a small campfire. We always learned to be safe, never putting in danger the forest, and ate some beans and sausages for dinner, together with some tasty Belgian beers. Around 11 p.m., we decided to call it a night, and we each went to sleep in our tents and sleeping bags. Everything seemed like a normal camping day in our forest. Then, suddenly, at around 1:30 a.m., we woke up to the sound of what seemed to be like drums. A couple of us got out of our tents with our flashlights, asking what was going on. Our forest had always been a quiet place at night, and during the day the only noise you could hear were the critters. So, imagine the surprise of hearing drums in the middle of the night. We were located on a flat area on the side of a hill to have a beautiful view in the morning. And at the other side of the hill, over the top, we saw light and smoke of what seemed to be a bonfire. We figured that had to be the place where the drum noise was coming from. So the ones who had gotten out of our tents decided to just go over there to see what was going on and maybe talk with the people who decided that it was a good plan to be making noise in a calm forest at 1:30 a.m. We hiked over the hill so that we could have a glance at the people to know who we were dealing with first. We walked about 15 minutes before we could actually see the bonfire. It was located in a small circled clearing with lots of trees and bushes around. We crouched towards the bushes in the tree line to get a look at what was going on, and that is when we saw the people with the drums. A couple of them, I recall a group of 5 to 6, sat around the fire playing the same tune on the drums the whole time, and another group of people was dancing around the bonfire. Although I say dancing right now, I mean people making weird, unnatural movements, almost as if they were having spasms, and honestly, the best way to describe it is bodies contorting. The people dancing around the circle were wearing suits. A first glance would make it look like people dressing to be one with nature. A second glance would make it look like pagan suits, almost like the original celebrations of Halloween. See, Samhain. This was when we realized that, whatever these people were doing, whether it was some sort of gag or seriously some sort of ritual, we would be better off if we did not confront them. So we decided to back off and go back to our camping spot as quiet as possible. Once there, we decided to wake the rest and tell them what we had seen. We packed up that same moment and left to the entrance of the forest, got on our bikes, and all went back home. We have since still frequented the forest, both for scouts and in our free time with friends and family, and we have never seen this circle of people again. However, it has stuck with me ever since, and I will never forget how we felt out of our place in the forest for the first time in our lives. It is the first and, luckily, the last time that we did not feel welcome in our own forest. I was born and raised in a remote area. A Pacific Northwest National Forest, to be precise. The handful of small communities out there, none of which I lived anywhere near, had a lot of Bigfoot stories. If that gives you some idea. Anyway, during the summers of my teen years, it started seeming like an amusing or comfortable idea to sleep in the hammock affixed to part of the exterior of the house. For a while, it was actually quite lovely. Until I woke up one night to the sound of crunching. Like, massive ducking crunching. I'm not sure how to convey what this noise was. The best I could ever come up with was to imagine a dog eating dog food. That crunching, gnawing noise. Next, multiply it by 10. Like a 1,000-pound dog eating dog food size to it. Of the 4 sides of the house, my hammock obviously being on one, the sound was originating from an adjacent side to me, on the gravel driveway/entrance side. The back door was on the other adjacent side. So I slipped out of that hammock as quietly and swiftly as I could and went for that door. I managed to get my folks up, but to no avail. Over the next couple weeks, it happened a few more times. We eventually figured out that the noise seemed to come on nights following our dumping of cooking oil on the gravel driveway. Over time, this produced rough patches of asphalt. Our goal was to ultimately get the whole thing. So once we had that figured, I hatched a plan. At age 15, I decided that after we dumped oil next, I would lie in wait in the bed of the truck until the thing returned. And I would be able to catch it in the act. It worked, sort of. The thing arrived. I was alerted by the intensely loud crunching. Way louder than I was used to. So ducking close, just outside, probably. But I never found out, I was way too scared to sit up and look. Nor did I have the nerve to try the trap again for a long time. And after that, I never heard the crunching again. I guess whatever critter it was moved on. I've no doubt there was a mundane explanation for it. But I didn't discover it. Sure, it could be a bear, elk, or other large animal doing something weird and unexpected. Like rolling in the gravel. But that's not what it was sounding like to me at the time. And I never got a definitive answer. So the mystery haunts me. It was 2013. I went camping with a few friends to ensure their safety. I'll call them John, Stephen, and Derek. Now I live in California. By the way, I will not tell exactly where I live for safety reasons. It was in the summer. I say a little bit after my birthday on June 10th. We got to the campsite at about sunset. We set up our tents and a pit, and I went to go grab firewood because it was getting darker the whole time we were there. It was normal, no weird occurrences started happening yet. John was complaining that there was a rotting smell lingering about, and every now and then when someone went to take a leak, we'd hear wrestling in the trees and in the bushes. We just brushed it off as if it were nothing, but I wish we just left because later on, when it turned to night while we were sleeping, I was awoken by what sounded like a cry. It was between a girl and an animal. It sounded like they were saying, "Help me." It sounded close by, so I thought it might be some other campers, so I ignored it as some prank to scare us or Derek. He does stuff like that sometimes, so I tried to get back to sleep until the cry got louder and it sounded more animal-like, like until it didn't make words at all. Then I started hearing wrestling again, so I thought it was John or Stephen going to take a leak. All our tents were next to each other, so it'd be simple to talk to one another. Derek was to the left of me, and Stephen was to my right. John was in the middle. I asked Derek if it was him, and he said to me, "Stop making noises." At that point, I was really freaking out. Then the noises got closer. Everyone woke up. Everyone assumed it was the other person playing a joke but shortly found it something out there. The hunting equipment was in the truck, so eventually Stephen got the guts to actually go out his tent with his flashlight. He didn't say anything. He said, "I don't hear anything. Just keep hearing it," until we heard a blood-curdling cry. From all around us it wasn't multiple things though, it was just one, you could tell by the way it was, so then we all got out of our tents and shining our flashlights all around still didn't see anything. I was beginning to get scared. I said to Derek, "We need to go," because we took his truck. We looked up further into the distance of the woods. We looked off in every direction of the trees until we saw them. They weren't glowing red or yellow, so I don't think it was a skinwalker or Wendigo. I am native Navajo and have some Cherokee, so I know about them and have even had encounters, but this was something else. The eyes were small white dots just floating, peering deep into our souls. Derek shined his light on it. We barely got a glimpse because he dropped his flashlight. The moment he took even a peek at it, he was frozen only for a moment, and then he said, "Run." I've never seen him that scared before. Even when we were kids, he would get in trouble from his mom, so I didn't take a second thought before grabbing him and bolting it. We took off. We all got in his truck, and I took the keys from the glove box. We drove off, and behind us I saw in the rearview mirror. It was gaining on us quickly. I floored it and kept going with that thing. Was keeping up with us, no problem. It tried to get on top of the truck, but John shot a bullet at it. He must have hit because we were getting ahead of it and eventually made it out. I didn't realize I lost it before we were almost out of gas. I'm never going camping without sleeping with a gun. This happened last summer. My girlfriend and I traveled all over North Georgia to see the amazing waterfalls and hiking trails. Let's call her Erin. We were heading through the Chattahoochee National Forest near Helen, and we were heading to DeSoto Falls. My GPS was acting up, and it led us to this off-road path that is meant for trucks and jeeps. My girlfriend was not happy because her suspension kept bottoming out and hitting rock under the car. I was glad I didn't bring my car because it's very low. This road was miles long in the Chattahoochee Forest, and she was sure that we went the wrong way, but we kept following the GPS. Her daughter, who is 9, Mia was crying silently in the back, afraid that we were lost. But I assured her that we were okay. We have plenty of water and food, so I wasn't worried, but if we had a flat, it was over because I doubt she has a spare tire. Yeah, I didn't want to admit it, but we couldn't find the trailhead. So we found a gravel parking lot and decided to hike the random path we came across. We were the only car there. So we grabbed our backpack and water bottles and went off. Erin usually walks in front with Mia behind her, and I walk last, so Mia is always insightful. They both stopped suddenly, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said they needed to use the bathroom quick, so they rushed ahead like sprinting, and I was trying to keep up, but all the added weight of the backpack was a challenge to keep up. They went behind a huge boulder and did their business. We proceeded and noticed quick that this trail hasn't been maintained very well, with trees fallen on the path and trash like food wrappers and canned food empty along the path. But we proceeded. I noticed that they both kept looking around us like they saw someone. Both of them kept acting weird, but I thought, hey, it's their first secluded hike. They're just paranoid. 3 miles in, it started to get cloudy and dark fast. So we rushed back. Finally back to the car, and it was almost pitch black out there. I had to pee, so I went back to the trail to find a tree to go. While walking back, I see a broken trail sign saying trail closed. I came back in the car, and they were discussing something among themselves. And I asked what happened. They said they heard growling come from the trail after I went back to pee, but I didn't hear anything. They were freaking out and wanted to leave. While heading back on a crazy path down the mountain, it was pouring rain, and the car almost got stuck on certain parts of the path. Aaron was telling me that before they stopped when I caught up, they had the feeling that they were being watched and kept seeing black shadows on the corner of their eyes. Mia said she heard more growling, and then Aaron agreed and said she thought she was the only one hearing the growls. I was confused and upset because they didn't tell me any of this. Aaron is the super protective type and is always cautious. She explained that she felt like she was drawn to go deeper and deeper down the trail, and didn't listen to her gut feeling to head back. I thought to myself she was tired and just needed rest. Later that night, it didn't take long for Aaron to pass out, as soon as she hit the bed. I couldn't sleep, so I tossed and turned. Finally I fell asleep, but then awakened suddenly to Aaron having a nightmare, kicking me in her sleep, repeating, "I gotta find her. I gotta find her. I gotta find her." Tossing and screaming. I'm looking at her like WTF. I hug her to calm her down. I guess that triggered her to wake up, and she got up quick and sprinted to Mia's room and was relieved to see her fast asleep. She walked back to bed, and I asked her what she dreamed about, and she said a blurry black figure took her daughter. She was running looking for her in the dark woods and then heard something growling chasing her, trying to get her. She had these dreams after every hike we went on. I take us to a tourist trail with high traffic of people now, and carry a firearm for deep, secluded trails. It was simple, but it really creeped me out. My dad and I used to hike 14ers in Colorado. Was camping with my dad, brother, and friend on Mount Massive in Colorado in mid-August. Clear night with a full moon. We were all in the tent, starting to doze off. It was pretty late, maybe 2 a.m., as we got in late and spent a long time talking and joking. We heard someone whistling in the distance, down the mountain, on the trail we had just come up. It wasn't a bird or animal, because whatever it was whistling random musical phrases. It was very far away and very faint. This went on for about half an hour, but never seemed to change location or distance. We figured that someone was camping downhill. It stopped, but around 3 we were woken up by loud whistling again, distant, but closer. This time, the whistling kept getting closer. Eventually we heard the sound of someone walking near our camp. Whoever it was got about to where our fire pit was and stopped. We all kind of froze. Everything stayed silent for a few more minutes. Then the guy suddenly and sharply whistled again just once, not sure how to describe it in text, but that 2-note catcall type whistle some douche would give a pretty girl. It was so loud that my friend Dante, normally a real tough guy, jumped and shook a little. We heard some more movement and then a loud smash, like someone had taken a large rock and thrown it against some other rocks. We then heard whoever it was running away at a ridiculous speed, but heading further up the trail, not down the mountain, quickly. We could hear him running for what felt like an eternity. About half an hour later, a giant thunderstorm started. In the middle of the storm, we still occasionally heard the goddamn whistling way up the mountain. It was even creepier between thunder cracks. He was close but not right next to us, just hanging out whistling in a ducking mountain thunderstorm. We barely slept that night and got up at crack of dawn. We didn't finish the hike. Partly due to lack of sleep, but we also didn't want to head in the direction where this person went. We didn't see anyone in the area in the morning, and everyone we ran into was heading up the trail, not back down, so whoever it was probably still up the mountain. 4 grown men, and we were scared shitless the whole night. Guess it could have just been some weird solo hiker out in the rain who slipped on some rocks or something. But hiking solo with no light at 2 a.m. on Mount Massive in a thunderstorm is generally not a sane thing to do. So I experienced a pretty frightening event when I visited my friend in Hawaii last March. I've always wanted to share this story here, but I just never got around to doing it. Anyway, here's a little background. I met my friend, let's call him Melko, while I was in the Marines. He's native Hawaiian, and I'm from Southern California, and we were both stationed in the Mojave Desert for about 3.5 years. We became pretty close. We ate, worked, shit, slept, and drank, immensely, together. Anyways, I got to know him pretty well, so believe me when I say this guy was super spiritual. He believed in all these crazy Hawaiian legends, he was really respectable of the land and hated how outsiders were causing the Hawaiian gods to be angry, thus erupting all the volcanoes. One time, he was pissed drunk, and I was helping him back into bed when I reached to grab him. He started to fight me and started screaming, "Please don't curse my family." Me and my other buddies always found it kind of funny and kind of gave him shit for that. All in good fun. Anyway, you get the point. We both left the military last year, and we've always talked about me going over to Hilo, where he's from, to visit once we were out. He wanted to take me hunting, cliff jumping, and all sorts of crazy stuff. This guy was crazy. So last March I flew out to visit my dear friend. Just a couple of days of being there, nothing strange happened. I loved it there. It was nice seeing Melko, getting drunk, going swimming, seeing sea turtles, and all that happy horse shit. On the third night there, he decided to go boar hunting. So we got his Jeep loaded up with the essentials and started out into the rainforest. We went down this dirt trail for a couple of miles, got out, and began hiking. He used to boar hunt all the time with his uncle, so I felt comfortable even though we were only equipped with a makeshift spear, a couple of machetes, and some tomahawks. I didn't really think we were going to catch anything. I just thought it was fun being out in the middle of the forest at night. It was pretty spooky, though. I couldn't help but think of Jurassic Park. We were hiking, probably about a mile out, not on any trail, just making our way through the dense forest. The next part, I swear, was real. Craziest shit in my life. Out in the distance, we heard yelling/singing, kind of like a howling. But it wasn't from animals, it sounded like humans. Melko froze. He was like, shit, dude. I just looked at him. What the duck is that, dude? I wasn't really scared till I saw my friend look absolutely petrified. I thought maybe it was just some campers. But the yelling got louder, and it seemed like it was pretty ducking close. My friend dropped everything and threw himself on the ground. Dude, get down. He hushed at me. I was pretty scared at this point, so I did just that. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. The yelling started to get clearer, it sounded like a few dozen people. Then we started to hear drums. No shit, they were beating drums. They were loud and synchronized. Holy shit dude, those are ancient warriors, man. Trust me, take off your clothes. Melko then proceeded to take off all his clothes, no shit. He was butt-ass naked, lying face down. He kept insisting I take my clothes off, but I was really confused and thinking this was a prank. But the drums got louder and louder. We were both quiet, and every time I tried asking him what warriors he was talking about, he would, shh, me. Whatever was beating those drums and making those chants was right behind us, in the trees. I don't know how they moved so fast and silently when me and Melko had to fight our way through the jungle. The chants and beating suddenly stopped, and I swear there were people right behind us watching us. Then I got the biggest chills ever, all throughout my body. From my toes to my ears. We just stayed there, on the ground, silent for a few minutes. We heard the drums beating again, only this time in front of us and pretty far away. They grew faint. Dude, let's go. My friend said as he got up with all of his stuff in his arms as he started running, yes, still butt-ass naked. He put his shorts and shoes on after a bit of running. We sprinted all the way back to the Jeep and booked it out of there. It was until we got back to his house that he started talking. He told me that those chants were from ancient warrior spirits, and the purpose of lying down while naked was so they could scan our bodies and so we could show that we meant no harm. Now I'm a huge skeptic about shit like that. I was raised Catholic, and I used to be super religious in high school, but I grew away from religion in general ever since then. But duck, what I heard that night and what I felt were very real. There was no way it could have been some teenagers playing a prank. They moved swiftly through the forest and covered so much distance. I haven't experienced anything like that since my visit. Anyways, if you're in Hawaii and hear random ass drums in the middle of the night, get naked and stay the duck down. When I was a kid, I grew up at a campground and literally spent the whole summer there, as a relative managed it and worked night security. So I'd been camping throughout my life. On my 21st birthday, some buddies and I decided to go on a trip and do some real camping way out in the bush. We mapped a nice spot near a small river along the coast of Lake Superior and set off on our way. It was only a few hours to the boat launch, and we would canoe along the beach for a few miles to get to this spot. We're talking about being really remote. The nearest road was 5 miles, and other than trekking through the woods, the only way to get there would be to go back the way we came, along the beach. So we set up camp near dark, get nice fire going, and bullshit and drink for a few hours. By around midnight we were all getting tired. After all the paddling and stuff we had to do, we were pooped, so we go to our tents. Now, even though I've been camping my whole life, I'm still a light sleeper, and I can hear something moving around outside the tents, on the periphery of the campsite. Heavy steps, but clearly they are shoes. Naturally, I assume one of my friends is going to take a piss, even though I didn't hear any tent zippers. The steps fade away towards the beach, and after 20 minutes or so I forget about them and begin to drift off to sleep. Next morning we all get up and start making breakfast and collecting wood. The walk never comes up, so we carry on. Later in the day, we all head to the river to fish some and split off into groups. I'm fishing with the friend in the tent next to mine, and when the other guys split off, he starts asking if I heard anything last night. I tell him about the footsteps, and he nods. He then tells me that about an hour after they walked off they came back. I mentioned to him that it was probably someone from camp, and he tells me that he doesn't think so because they never went into a tent. He says that the steps walked past the tents and then carried on into the woods. Jump forward to the last day of the trip, no footsteps are heard all through the week. Until the last night. We all settle in early since we have to pack all our shit up and paddle back, and about half an hour in, I can hear the steps off at the back edge of the clearing again. They are kind of faint, but as I can start to hear them more clearly, they pick up pace until they are at a full run, and they storm past all the tents, back towards the beach again. We are talking full speed sprint. If you've ever heard a person running while you're still, it's ducking loud as shit. This time we all wake up, and everybody climbs out of their tents, flashlights ready. Everybody is present, but there is no sign of whatever or whoever ran through. The soil in the area was fairly soft. If it was a deer or a bear, there would be clear prints. If it were a human, there would have definitely been some footprints, but even the tall grass wasn't disturbed along the edge of the site. Nobody got any sleep after that. We packed up all of our stuff except the chairs and waited around our fire until the sun came up. Was hiking in New Zealand, not far from Auckland, alone, in the bush, and listening to audiobooks. The last one was some H.P. Lovecraft story about Cthulhu, with human sacrifice. One of those audiobooks with sound effects and music. So lots of screaming and chanting and weird sounds. But hey, nice sunny day in the bush, awesome tramping, so not scary at all, but a good story to listen to. I decided to set up camp in a cave, a very cool place. It used to be a sea cave a couple centuries ago, but the ocean has been pushing sand and is now 5 kilometers from there, so it's just sand. The cave is huge. In the last century, people used to come here to dance on weekend nights. There even was a wooden floor and all. This is now buried under meters of sand. Well anyway, I set up my tent, started to cook my dinner, and ate. Then a guy comes and tells me that he and his friends are coming to play drums and stuff in the cave for about an hour, and am I cool with it? I said sure, I love drums, and the acoustic of the place is sweet. So here he comes in the cave with his friends. My tent was set up at the back of the cave, so I sit there and watch them while finishing my dinner. They come and sit in a circle in the middle of the cave, between me and the cave entrance. And they just sit there. For like 15 minutes, silently. Okay, I think maybe they are into yoga or whatever. Then they begin to scream randomly, every one of them, like crazy people. For about 5 minutes. At this point I'm thinking, well, that might be some group therapy, who am I to judge? But still, it sounded exactly like the stuff in my audiobook. Weird. After that, they began chanting and banging a tambourine, reciting prayers in a language that I didn't know. Then they stopped making any sound and just stayed standing in a circle, silent, for about 10 more minutes. And then they started screaming and laughing, but each one at a time. After an hour, they just left silently. I didn't sleep very well that night, wondering if they would come back to soothe me for Cthulhu. My friends and I were out camping once. It wasn't massively far from civilization. About a 30-minute walk would take us to a decent bit of civilization, and we were only about 5 minutes off a trail big enough for cars. Obviously we spent the evening getting thoroughly drunk, but some of us sobered up instantly when a car appeared on the trail. See, we weren't exactly camped legally, and some of us were drinking underage, and some of the other drugs present were illegal for any age. This car drives past where we're camped, slowly pulls off into the woods, and stops just out of our sight. We are freaking out because we don't want to get caught, but we figure the car will leave again soon enough. It doesn't. After a while, we start to wonder what it's doing. We start to wonder not only about getting caught but also about our safety. Nobody was in a great position to defend themselves. So, a couple of us gear up with torches and decide to check it out. We get as close to the car as we dare and call out to the driver under the guise of, "Hey man, are you okay? Do you need help?" A guy calls back, seemingly out of breath, and says, "I can manage it on my own." I don't want to know what it is, so I decide to duck right off, and everyone I'm with gets the same idea. I don't know why we didn't leave the area, but we went back to the camp and just told everyone it was fine to not scare them. Now, the only drug I had that night was alcohol, and I didn't drink any more after that. The car left after about an hour, and this next bit was probably my drunken imagination, but I stayed up the whole night, and I saw a couple of figures off in the distance watching us. At least, I hope it was my imagination. However, no one attacked us, and we proceeded to use that camping site for several trips. So, I want to start off by saying that I am a very skeptical guy. I became an atheist when I was 17, and when my belief in God dissipated, the belief in everything else supernatural went out the window as well. I also want to say that I've lived in Appalachia for all but 4 years of my life, and I'm almost 22, and I have never experienced any of the creepy things people say about the Appalachian Mountains. Until the story I'm about to tell you. So toward the end of last year, 2023, me and 2 of my friends had sort of simultaneous quarter-life crises, which eventually led us to getting rid of almost all of our belongings, quitting our jobs, leaving our apartments, and living out of our cars and door-dashing around the country. Well, on our first night on our big trip, we went to stay with a friend of one of my travel buddies. She lived in Tennessee in the Appalachian Mountains. The Smoky Mountains, specifically. Which, for those of you who don't know, is like a subcategory of the Appalachians. She lived off a back road in the middle of the woods. The first night we were there, she had told us that there were strange occurrences on the property. The house was haunted, and there was something in the woods. She had told us that whatever is in the woods likes to hang out around her shed. She said that one night she was walking up onto her porch when she got the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Becoming fed up with whatever it was, she screamed something along the lines of "Go the duck away" into the woods, only for something to scream it right back at her. She claimed to have seen it one night from her kitchen window. She said it was peeking around the shed, staring at her. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. Out of curiosity, I asked her to describe whatever creature she saw in more detail, but she refused. I, being the skeptic that I am, basically disregarded everything she said and forgot about it. Now, because it was our first night on the trip, and it was so fun and new to us, we wanted to sleep in our cars, which were parked right in front of the shed I mentioned earlier. Yes, that shed. We hadn't yet made window covers, so we were sleeping in 3 SUVs with uncovered windows completely surrounding us. But I had no issue with this. I thought the worst that could happen would be that I'd wake up with a bear staring at me. So, I went to bed peacefully and woke up in the middle of the night, really needing to pee. I got half dressed, put on my shoes, left my car, walked to the edge of the woods, did my business, and got back in my car and went to sleep. I had not a single care in the world. No uneasy feeling, no feeling of being watched, nothing. The next night, I once again woke up, really needing to pee. So, just like I did the night before, I sat up in bed, put on my pants, got my shoes ready, and reached for the door handle. But I couldn't do it. It was like every hair on my body stood on end, and I got this overwhelming feeling of dread and foreboding. Now, I had a makeshift bed in the back of my SUV, on top of all the back seats that I flipped down. So I'm sitting there in my bed, looking around through all of my uncovered windows. I can't see anything outside, except for some faint outlines of trees and the glints off of my travel buddies' cars. I neither saw nor heard anything that should be putting me on edge. I reached for the door handle again, but I once again got that terrible feeling. I continued to look around, try to reach for the door, and withdraw my hand. I finally gave up and said screw it and just peed in an empty water bottle. The next morning, I got up and was talking to my travel buddies, and one of them mentioned waking up in the middle of the night out of nowhere and experiencing an overwhelming feeling of being watched. She sat up in her makeshift bed and looked all around, only to see nothing. I can't lie, when she said that, I got a bit of a knot in my stomach. I asked her what time it was when that happened, and she estimated that it was around the same time I woke up, around 3 a.m. I then told both of them about my experience, and we were all a little freaked out about it. When we were headed out to our cars the following night, we noticed that all of the homeowner's 5+ outdoor cats were all sitting on her front porch, which we hadn't seen the last 2 nights. Previously, they would all be scattered around the property, if they were even in sight. We thought it was weird, but we didn't think much of it. We all climbed into our cars and said our goodnights on our walkie-talkies. It was a pretty warm and muggy night for October, so we all had our battery-powered fans running. One of my friends frustratedly reported that her walkie-talkie was dying. Then, my other friend reported that their fan had died. Then my walkie started dying. And it continued until, in the span of 5 minutes, all of our electronic camping gear, walkies, flashlights, and fans, had all died. Finding this incredibly creepy, we all decided that we should just sleep in the house to be better safe than sorry. We were gathering up our things to move inside when I began to hear what sounded like something large walking through the leaves in the woods. I kept stopping what I was doing and looking toward my friends, who were standing right by the woods. They seemed unbothered every time, so I would just continue what I was doing. That was when I heard a louder noise coming from the woods and finally decided to walk over to my friends. Turns out, one of them was standing watch while the other one gathered the rest of her things. Me and my friend stood there watching my other friend's back, and it kept sounding like whatever was in the woods kept getting closer to us. Soon enough, my friend had gathered all her things, and we calmly but quickly went into the house. From what I can remember, we slept in the house the following night as well, but the night after that, one of my friends borrowed some sage from the homeowner and saged all along the wood line and around our vehicles before we got ready for bed. We slept perfectly fine for that night and every night after. No more weird feelings, noises, nothing. Of course, we were pretty much perpetually on edge from then on, but it was never quite the same feeling of dread and foreboding that I had felt before. To be honest, I don't know what to make of all of it. I know I didn't see anything. But the feeling I got was unlike anything I had ever experienced. That was the first and only time in my life where I have gotten that feeling, especially just out of nowhere. A buddy and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail, only the NC to SC portion. It was summer, and the weather was great. Blah blah blah. We cross into South Carolina and meet a super nice elderly couple and talk with them and eat a late lunch with them. We made camp about half a mile from them after we parted ways. So we're about to fall asleep in the tent when we hear some rustling in the brush around the campsite. That's fairly common. There are a shitstorm of squirrels and other animals around. The rustling didn't sound like a squirrel after a while, and it was actually multiple sounds coming from multiple places around us. My first thought, being a southerner who hunts, was, OSHT, a pack of coyotes is here, time to man up. All I have is a .45 with 10 rounds, so I was really hoping it was a pack of skidding coyotes. I was so wrong. We started hearing what sounded like low-level incantations. So after a few minutes, I'm fairly relieved that I don't have to fight coyotes, but then I remember that Carolina mountain folk can be some weird people. The chanting is getting closer, and we could audibly hear what appeared to be about 10 men clearly and repeatedly chanting "Lord help us, Lord save us." It was similar to low-level and slow rhythmic monk chanting, if that helps. Well, that's creepy as shit, so I decide to let anyone near our tent know that we are armed inside. I take out the magazine, because I don't want to eject a round, and pull the slide back and let go to clearly make the sound of a gun being racked. Obviously I put the magazine in and chambered a round after. That sound must have done the trick because they just walked past us. They were literally walking through our campsite to get to some type of gathering. We didn't sleep that night at all. It was the last night of the trip for us, so we kind of brushed it off to a crazy, weird story to cap off the trip. 2 days later we are hanging out with some friends, and a TV is on in the background and happened to be on the local news. There is a story running about an elderly hiking couple found murdered on the Appalachian Trail, about 2 miles from where we camped. They showed their pictures, and sure enough, it was the couple we met. They had been ended, and found organized around a ritual site, like they were placed specifically according to some crazy demonic seance. We literally could have been swooped up by those men, and that could have happened to us, and all the time I think about that poor couple and what happened to them. Carolina mountain people are a really odd breed sometimes. My husband's grandmother lives in a quiet village, maybe 15 to 20 minutes away by car from the nearest town. Most of the people who live in her village have family plots and orchards, and for the most part their houses are built just by the main, single-lane, road, with thick jungle behind and between, as well as a rather hilly topography. I'd rather not disclose our location, but we'll say it is in Southeast Asia. About 2-3 months ago, as my husband and I left his grandmother's house after visiting, came around 2 to 3 p.m., left around 9 p.m., we passed by a car parked by the side of the road, as well as a police car and fire truck, but thought nothing much of it. The next day when we came to visit, there were an astounding number of cars parked just where the police were the night before, including the military. Turns out a man had gone missing the day before, a 72-year-old retired school teacher who bought a plot of land only accessible by walking through some shrubbery and crossing a river via a wooden bridge. He had apparently gone to the plot earlier in the day to clear out weeds and whatnot with 2 of his foreign employees. According to them, as they were getting ready to leave, he asked them to go ahead without him because he wanted to walk around the area. Hours later, as darkness fell, he still had not shown up, which is when the employees finally sought help. The employees were detained for a while for questioning as they were the last to see him, but from my understanding they were released as they were not believed to be involved with their employer's disappearance. Search parties were conducted day and night, every day, by his relatives, friends, villagers, volunteers, the police, and the military for a month, but there haven't been any concrete leads, mostly rumors and speculation. Some of these rumors. To ease the telling of the story a little, I'll be referring to my in-laws as my own, so grandma instead of my husband's grandmother, and so on. I'll also be referring to the missing man as John, as I'd rather not disclose his real name out of respect for his family. John had bought a plot of land a few months prior some way down the road. Fruit season can be a very lucrative as well as a great time for family bonding around here, so it's not uncommon for people to sell orchards and plots of land and enjoy a great payday. The plot of land where John went missing was sold by a different person. I've never met this man, but Grandma knows him as most of the area belongs to them and their siblings. There are 9 aunts and uncles, pretty normal around here. The plot of shrubbery through which one would walk to get to John's land also belongs to an aunt and is immediately next to a compound on which an uncle and auntie's families both have houses. From there, you would have to go downhill and cross the river I mentioned earlier. Most of the rumors I've heard come from Grandma and 2 uncles who have assisted in the search efforts. One used to work in the forestry department, and the other was in the military. All grew up with the jungle as their backyard. One of the most prevalent rumors here was that he was taken or hidden by Orang-Hallows, a term most people in this region use to refer to wood sprites, certain jinn, spirits from nature, or generally the unseen, though it is distinct from Hantu, which is used more to describe ghosts and the plethora of scarier creatures. They are known to be similar to humans in most forms, including the physical, down to having families, villages, intentions, and religions. These houses and villages usually just look like trees to most folk, but to those they choose to show it to, they look like their regular counterparts. They differ in that, besides being undetectable by most humans, time also passes slowly for them. Most would say a day spent in their realm is equal to 3 days in our time. They also tend to live quite long lives and may sometimes make friends or even have relations with humans, though those stories are far and few between. It isn't entirely uncommon, however, to meet people who are a bit more sensitive to the other realm and can see, hear, or just feel their presence. I myself know quite a few people, including a nephew who accidentally freaks individuals out quite a lot by pointing out what he sees. Most get used to it and accept it as part of them. Some would prefer if they weren't gifted at all. In some cases, when people enter these areas, they suddenly become befuddled and are not able to find their way out, but they do not tend to experience seeing anything paranormal. This nearly happened to one of the military units during one of the night searches, but thankfully they managed to find their way out. In other cases, they may encounter a human-like figure or what they believe is another human, and after engaging with them, come home to find they were presumed missing by friends and family. Usually for the latter, the missing is found in good health and in clean clothing, certainly not like they were missing and fighting to survive. In both cases, the missing tend to believe they were not away for long but were, in actual fact, gone for much longer. There have also been cases where the missing could see and hear the search party but could not be seen or heard by the search party. According to an uncle, the K9 unit was brought in during the initial search, and the dogs ended up by a dead tree not too far from the starting point, so large you couldn't wrap your arms halfway around the trunk, and kept walking around and scratching at it. This was the weirdest thing to hear for me, although quite a few people have speculated that John had perhaps fallen into the river while making his way out. Some of the stories I've heard make me somewhat doubt that. When explaining what happened, the 2 employees made it seem like John had noticed or seen something interesting around the area and had asked them to go ahead without him as he wanted to check out the vicinity, supposedly his words, translated. Interestingly enough, this was when Grandma told me one of the local ladies had had a first-hand account some time prior, whereby she was foraging in the jungle and happened upon a great village where she was pretty certain there had always been trees, complete with houses and a place of worship. I assumed she just got out of there as fast as she could. Grandma also told me about her grandfather, they've lived there for generations, who was familiar and could interact with the Orang-Hallows who lived in the area. During the few weeks after John's disappearance and news had spread quite widely, a number of people showed up and volunteered their services to the family. John's family was quite well off, and it seems some people were looking for the piece of fame, money, and/or glory that would come with the success of finding John. From what I heard, most of them would go about it quite aggressively, sprinkling holy water and salt and demanding John be returned. Others had dreams and visions, that John was taken away by an Orang-Hallows who had seen and took a liking to him, or that he decided to take one as his wife and decided to stay in that realm. Presumably his real wife was not keen on hearing this. There were also rumors that John tended to carry a lot of money on his person and that his employees basically killed him and put on a show. As far as I know, nothing came out of any of these rumors, and now a few months later, most efforts have pretty much ceased, although we would still occasionally see John's kids parked by the road, if only to sit, wait, and pray at the camp that was set up earlier. Grandma thinks they went about it the wrong way and that if the Orang-Hallows did take him away, they might actually be keeping him out of spite now, due to all the commotion and disrespect they've been getting. She said her grandfather would always tell his kin to treat the Orang-Hallows with respect, to speak and interact kindly and not be aggressive. Basically how you should treat another human being. I think he's right in that respect. There's still quite a lot in the world humans know little about, and our arrogance certainly doesn't help. Wherever John is, I wish him and his family peace. I was visiting my cousin in the country. Since she lived so far away, we rarely saw each other, so we were known to pull some crazy stunts. We were both on the back of a four-wheeler, heading to a small private cemetery just for the fun of it. The way to the cemetery is a stretch of woods to your left for about half a mile. Something caught my eye, and I told my cousin to stop. An opening that had not been there before was right in front of us. What do you think that is? I don't know. My cousin and I were both perplexed as to how, in the matter of a day, someone made a path in the woods. Should we go in there? I don't know, Abby, this feels kind of weird. Come on, let's just go check it out. I hopped off the four-wheeler, and my cousin was forced to follow me. The odd thing about this was that oftentimes my cousin was always the one pulling me into mischief, and I was the worried one, but something was pulling me down this path. I would be lying if I said there was anything odd as we walked down the path. The forest was a bit quieter than a normal forest would be, but nothing else was odd. Come on, Abby, there's nothing here, I sighed, as I was still set on exploring. All right. During the walk, the trail had not curved, nor had we taken any direction other than straight. The trail seemed to go on and on. I checked my phone, and it showed that we had been on this path for half an hour. Faith, check this out. I showed her the time, and her eyes widened. But we've only been in here for a couple minutes. I know. I turned off and we kept walking silently. Faith, I think we're lost. There's no way we didn't go any direction but straight. Now we were both worried. We just kept walking for what seemed to be 15 minutes. Faith, we're lost. I spoke hopelessly. Shh. What? Did you hear that? I had not heard anything, so I shrugged my shoulders. Moments later, however, I did hear a branch snap somewhere in the woods. Abby, someone's following us. It's probably just a fox or some other animal. My cousin was still uneasy. Suddenly, to our horror, all around us, we heard footsteps rushing at us. Run! My cousin screamed. I booked it after her, but since she was taller, she ran a little faster than me, and I was behind her. I was terrified that I would end up running through an endless forest, but no. We ran straight out of the forest and onto the four-wheeler. I looked at my phone again. It had been an hour. We never really talked about this event again, but the next time we went to the cemetery, there was no trail in the woods. The Kern's South Fork is a large river in the southeastern High Sierra. Forest Service personnel must repair the huge metal footbridge that crosses the Pacific Crest Trail every couple of years. One time during repairs, the men were interrupted by a horrendously loud bellowing scream. When they turned to look towards the scream, they supposedly saw a freaking Bigfoot in all his glory. Given that the men were armed, they attempted to shoot the creature, but their attempts were unsuccessful. Consequently, they left the area and never returned. I have visited this bridge numerous times throughout my life, and both my father and I have set up camp there. One time, about 10 years after the bridge event, my dad was camping in this area with his friend. One night, someone walking around the tent awakened my dad. Now, for context, that tent is about 8 feet tall in the middle. My dad reports that someone pushed something directly onto the tent's top before leaving. He attempted to awaken his friend, but he managed to sleep through the incident. I'm not claiming it was Bigfoot, but the proximity of those events scares me a little bit. I would consider myself an outdoorsman. I grew up in the sticks. I've spent a lot of my life wandering in and enjoying the backcountry. I'm older now and have settled down in the suburbs. Wife, 2 boys, a house, a dog, a desk job, the whole suburban shtick. I want opportunities for my kids that come from suburban life, but I also want them to grow up with an appreciation for the outdoors. So when my oldest son was big enough for his first solo father-son camping trip, I was excited. My wife and younger son stayed home for this midsummer trip. It was going to be a great bonding experience for me and my son. Because my son is just 5, I didn't want to do anything too extreme on our first big solo camping trip. We needed a place that wasn't too deep into the Colorado Front Range but still allowed for dispersed camping. I don't consider RV parks or established campgrounds to be actual camping. You might as well be at a motel watching TV. Camping, at most, is a tent, sleeping bag, and a fire. A dispersed camping area called Gordon Gulch, west of Boulder, caught my attention. I had never been to this area before. There were no facilities, and it was dispersed enough you couldn't see or hear other campers nearby. My son and I had a blast that day. We set up camp. Collected firewood. Went for a hike. Saw a moose and a bobcat. I tried a little fishing. And finally, as the sunlight faded, we returned to our campsite to light a fire. We had a traditional and nutritious camping meal of fire-burned hot dogs and marshmallows. It was a good day. Definitely a core memory for both my son and me. The perfect first camping experience for a preschooler. Or so I thought. After all that fun, my son and I were exhausted. It was time for bed. The sound of an evening summer breeze through the pines is better than any commercial sleep aid. I don't even remember drifting off. It was a hard, dreamless sleep that only physical exertion can bring. One thing about my son. He inherited many things from me: hair color, eye shape, disposition, and my unusually wide feet, but one peculiar thing he got from his mother was sleep talking. It's not unusual to hear him having full conversations in his sleep. It gets more pronounced when he's overly tired. I was catapulted out of the void of sleep. Not sure what aroused me, I sat up and collected myself. The world seemed to be at peace. It was quiet. It was just me and the breeze blowing through the treetops. I couldn't figure out what woke me so suddenly. The sound of my son laughing in his sleep cut through my groggy confusion. It was a deep belly laugh. Must be a fun dream, I thought hazily. Gently rocking him was enough to quiet him down. That must have been what startled me, I determined. As I repositioned to fall back to sleep, my son burst out laughing. I sighed and closed my eyes. He'll quiet down soon enough, I thought. He laughed again. This time his laugh was echoed by something outside our tent. I held my breath and listened. I'm unsure of what I just heard. It wasn't an echo. There was something out there, and it laughed in unison with my son. My grogginess vanished as the adrenaline began to pump. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening to the night. Hearing nothing after a minute, my muscles relaxed. I started to settle back down. Must have been hearing things. I was worn out after all. Checking the time, I saw it was 4 a.m. The sun would be up in a couple hours. My son laughed again. And again, it was answered with laughter outside. I was now absolutely certain it was not an echo. As I tried to make sense of what was happening, the voice outside called out my son's name. My blood ran cold. That voice. It was so familiar. Then it clicked in my brain. It was the voice of my younger son. That wasn't at all possible. He was safe at home with my wife, miles and miles away. I could hear twigs crunching beyond our thin nylon tent walls. It was impossible to tell the distance from us. However, there was something out there. Circling us. Unprompted this time, it called out my son's name in that little toddler voice. My 5-year-old, still fast asleep, called out to his brother, asking him to play. The thing outside the tent laughed in reply and urged my son to come outside. That thing with my little son's voice sounded cold. Hollow. Dead. The floodgates of my adrenaline burst open. Cold sweat formed on my face. I was frightened out of my mind, but my primal caveman brain roared to life. I was in Papa Bear mode. Nothing was going to take or hurt my son. I was putting a stop to this. Whatever it was out there, I didn't care. You don't mess with my kids. Say what you will, but when you're camping miles from anything, it's not worth the risk of being unarmed. Wild animals, wild people, you have to be prepared. I almost always take a firearm with me when I'm camping. Pepper spray and bear bells are great, but nothing gets attention from a conscious threat faster than the sound of chambering around. I spoke loudly into the night that I had a gun and was coming out. I hoped the fear in my voice was masked by my aggressiveness. The only reply was the breeze through the treetops. My son was still asleep. The kid is a hard sleeper. Another trait from his mom. My wife and I have joked that he could sleep through a tornado. Stepping out into the cool summer night, a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other, I surveyed the campsite. The fire was down to embers. Our fishing gear was leaning against the pickup. The firewood was still neatly stacked. Nothing seemed out of place. Not wanting to stray far from the tent or my sleeping son, I sat down outside the entrance. I waited in the dark with the flashlight off. Not far into the trees, I heard a branch break. Another snap followed, this time closer. I stood up and flashed my light in the direction of the sound. Nothing was there. The voice called out, this time from behind, and this time focused towards me. Daddy! Daddy! It was my youngest son's voice again. Crying out for me from the dark forest. I threw the light beam in that direction. A pair of shimmering green eyes were illuminated by my flashlight. They were only 2 or so feet above the ground. The same height as a toddler. I took a small step toward it. I wanted to see more. I needed to see more. The eyes, unblinking, remained in place. Getting closer didn't help reveal this thing. It seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. Almost devouring it. I couldn't make out its size, shape, or color. It seemed to swallow up all the light around it. Save for its 2 shimmering green eyes. That thing laughed in its hollow toddler's voice. This time with malice and cruelty in it. The eyes never looked away from me. Never blinking. Focused only on me. Like a predator before the pounce. Not wanting to give up any ground to a predator, I stepped forward again. It didn't move. Not knowing what to do, I screamed as loud as I could. I waved my arms, trying futilely to shove it away. The eyes shimmer. And as I stared back, the eyes shifted from green to amber. I watched as they began to ascend into the air. It became apparent to me that this thing had been crouching and was now standing up. I could only watch in silent terror as the eyes finally stopped rising, nearly 10 feet off the ground. The night air erupted with a deep growl. I could feel the vibrations in my gut. I couldn't see a mouth, but I could hear teeth snapping and gnashing. My son in the tent behind me began to scream. That was the only time the eyes lost focus on me and shifted towards the screams of my kid. My only reaction was to fire my gun into the air. The eyes quickly disappeared. My ears were ringing, but I could hear the growls turn to shrieks. Followed by a cacophony of crashing branches and undergrowth. I stood there until I couldn't hear the shrieking anymore. It trailed off deep into the trees. I was left with only the sound of the breeze on the treetops and the quiet sobbing of my child. Twilight was beginning to illuminate the forest. Shaking and exhausted, I sat down in the dirt in front of the tent. I tried to collect myself. "Daddy? Daddy? Where are you?" My 5-year-old shouted. That got me out of my daze. I picked myself up and went into the tent to retrieve him. When I put him in the truck, I locked the doors and wasted little time breaking down camp. We were out of that camp and back on the road by the time the sun broke over the horizon. I have no idea what is in those woods. I do plan to camp in that area again, albeit without my family and definitely with some friends. I am eager to learn more about this phenomenon. Thankfully, my son doesn't seem fazed by anything that happened that night. He thinks I was chasing a bear away from camp. And maybe he's right, I hope he is anyway. My son can't wait to go on another camping trip. But, truthfully, I'm thinking the next family camping trip might be at an RV park. Or even a motel. That's family camping, right? When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on some Weyerhaeuser timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left very suddenly. There was still unopened mail and magazines sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to the same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on the beds, clothes still in the drawers, a pantry full of canned and jarred food, half of it exploded or leaking after so many years. Dishes in the sink, dishes on the table. Unburned candles are still sitting out, waiting to be used. A fridge outside was full of food that had turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while, we checked out the farm. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons, wrapped in desiccated skins or picked bare. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that the entire place was undisturbed. There was no vandalism, no sign of entry, and as far as I could tell, we were the first people to set foot there in 40 years. Even though I'm 32 years old, the story I'm about to share still haunts me to this day. Just thinking about it, or in this case, typing about it, sends chills down my spine and makes me feel like a terrified child. Over the past 10 years, I have only shared this story with a small number of people due to the terrifying nature of the experience. However, I believe that sharing it with others can be therapeutic. Perhaps others have had a similar experience. If so, please share it with me. To give this story justice, I have to tell you about an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter this is about. Buckle up, this will be a long but definitely not boring. My name is Joshua, but I will change the names to protect the privacy of the others involved in this story. I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugar Loaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugar Loaf, and my friend, we will call him Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around some paranormal places in the Sugar Loaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity, which was really a piece of crap. Anyhow, it was late dusk becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area, first to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2-hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted, again, a bust, then an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted, once again, yawn. At this point it was getting close to midnight and my wife and I were getting pretty bored, and I spoke up to Bob, saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled, saying he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees in daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied no. He took the picture back and said that's because there aren't and there are no power lines either. About this time he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house, then after that it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside, nothing to light the night except the full moon above head and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did as he asked, and he led us to the side of the car where the fence, field, and wooded hillside were. He looked at his cell phone, which his phone and mine had no signal. This was 2003, and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 and told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even in complete darkness, I could tell this was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then, in complete darkness, I could tell this was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then, at exactly midnight, a small light flickers on in the middle of the hillside. A chill runs down my back as my wife, Bob, his girlfriend, and myself watch as this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, began to move, swaying back and forth. We sat and watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he did not know, but locals had told him that at midnight every night this lantern will light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything could scare me or hurt me, so since there were no houses around, I yelled out, "We see you. Wow, you are so scary with your little lantern." Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughter stopped as I looked to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth but moving down the hillside to the field at an unhuman pace. Gliding, it began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was because within seconds we were in the car and flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent until Bob spoke up, saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed, and if we decided to go back out anywhere, it'd be best to take my truck until he could get gas in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank." I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugar Loaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if we could take my truck to the next town over to get some food because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us to that town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key, and nothing happened. My truck was dead, deader than dead, no ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. For all intents and purposes, you would think the alternator was out. This strange situation left us all feeling uneasy, especially after the night we spent together. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front, and attempted to jump my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connect the jumper cables to his battery and mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second the cables in between the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire they burn up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the eerie moon and starlit night. Did I mention there were no light poles around? And we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was a boat motor. Now, like I said, this was the time of the year when it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still on land at night, but somebody was out on a boat. After midnight? When it had to be chilly as all get out with the wind hitting them, and from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast, but we saw nothing, that is, until the boat was about 50 yards away and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get in his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another. I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We are standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, the hoods up on both as the boat pulls up to the dock, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and me. They look at us and at our vehicles and one glance in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us and let out a small chuckle. "You fellers got some sort of car trouble?" One asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the still smoking ashes of what was the jumper cable. "Looks like it was more than your pussycat jumper cables could handle. You all need some help? We got some tools on the boat that I think can fix you guys' problems right up." Then the other man who had chuckled in the beginning says, fix them right up." I am speechless at this moment, probably with my mouth hanging open, I can't remember. As the two men walk back to their boat, we hear what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they are doing, but the spotlight is so blinding we can barely see. But the chain noise was enough. Bob looked at me, and without saying a word, we both jumped in his car and drove the duck out of there. For the next few hours we drove to a populated area of houses, which wasn't many in the rural area. We were pretty much stuck in since we had very little fuel, but we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking at any time those men would find us. Bob would turn his lights on every now and then, thinking he all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking at any time those men would find us. Bob would turn his lights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how ducking weird this whole ordeal had been, and he laughed, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night, I just didn't know it would be this sort of scary." At this point the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out, but the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes until the sun rose, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said yes, the local store opens up in about an hour, so we will be fine. I tell him in that case, then yes. We wake the women up and drive back to the hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left until sunrise, and we still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me, and I smile and do the motion for zipping my lips, and we all watch in wonder as right at sunrise the lantern slowly fades away to nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling safer now. When we get there, there is no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up and doors are still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere where I can get a cell signal and call for help, and I'll be damned. The truck started right up with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in this area to others and swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seance in haunted places and asked me if I would be willing to film their sessions in the haunted places for their records and that they would pay me well for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I have always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugar Loaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to film for them, but I had no interest in joining in. I was okay with watching and just getting to be out there looking into the paranormal again. So of course my next question was when and where we were going to be doing this at first. When he answered me, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut and told him I had changed my mind. Remember that lantern light out near Sugar Loaf? He asked me as if there was any way I could ever forget. Yeah, I stammered. Why do you ask? I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out why it is there and what it wants, Bob replied. I don't know, man, I said. Oh, come on, Josh. Trust me, you will be safe, and I am going to pay you $250 just to sit there and film it. He retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight because diapers, formula, and the like cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid and my new wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities but also buying only top-of-the-line baby products like toys, cribs, playpens, baby monitors, strollers, car seats, a combination pack and play/changing table, diaper genie, and designer baby clothes. So because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area he wanted to go back to. With how important it was, I made all the extra money I could, so against my better judgment, I accepted the offer, and a week later I was in the same beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before, This time with Bob and 2 guys and 1 girl that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces or something of the sort. It was 11:50 when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence line, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. As I have been typing this entire story, I have been getting knots in my stomach knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story haunts my dreams and even waking hours to this day. I am going to do my best to describe how the following events unfolded, though I know mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued or how horribly horrific the events sounded and were, so when reading or listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up, and believe me when I say, up to this point in my life, I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting or get myself spooked or whatever, but after this night, I never look at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away as possible. As much as I dread it, I will now finish telling this story. As his group is chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book, not like a scary antique spell book or anything. It looks like a newer hardcover. Anyway, he starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone and tells his group to be quiet and look at the hill. I turn the camera, and at midnight on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool didn't seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob instructs his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they began again chanting and Bob reads from the book. Then they start asking questions in hopes the spirit will respond. About this time, a wind picks up and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute, and I oblige and stop recording and watch as Bob tries his lighter, then 2 lighters from his group, but none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spin around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around, I am blinded by the brightest light I have ever seen, what I believe was the lantern up close and personal, but as quick as it appears the light is gone, and the lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me, with me not realizing it within the span of maybe 30 seconds. I look around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It's only 12:15 or so, and the light has always stayed until sunrise. At this moment, the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick, and I see it light up, and I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I am talking about, but before I can answer them, we are all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from seemingly nowhere and everywhere around us but distant at the moment like far off, and this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands, of children that haunts me to this very moment. As I type this, I am looking around at the room I am in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. Also, it just occurred to me that if you put the letter S at the beginning of laughter, it spells slaughter.uck. Why did I just think that? The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine listening to a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start and seconds later another will join in starting at the beginning of the song and so on and so forth. Well, this sounded like I said, like hundreds or thousands of children laughing, as if one would start laughing and seconds later another would, and that pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row your boat," I am saying they laughed in unison, just like kids do when singing "Row, row your boat." One would start, then seconds later another would, then another and another and another, and the laughter was getting louder, closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, and giggling all around us, coming from all directions. I was shaking, I could not move, I was spinning around and around, looking off in the distance. This couldn't be real, this sort of thing does not happen. What the duck was happening? I scream at Bob and his group that we need to get the duck out of there, but they are already all running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candle behind, and without hesitation, I run after them and jump in the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul us out of there and drive about a mile up the road and pull over as Bob is in no condition to drive as we are all freaking out. We all get out of the car, pacing around the car, asking each other if we really just heard what we just heard. I tell Bob that I am sorry, but I left his camera behind. He says he does not care and that he isn't going back for it. At this point, I got my hands on my knees, panting, trying to catch my breath, as I have never in my life been so terrified. That is when all of our chatter stops as we once again hear the laughter off in the distance, Very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder until once again it is becoming deafening. We jump back in the car and speed away. We drive about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles we can all still hear the laughter in the distance with our windows down a little. We all begin to calm a little by mile 4, when the laughter can no longer be heard, but we have no intention of pulling over again, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone waiting for a signal to pop up, and at about mile 6, Bob's companion says, "Hey, I got full bars." And he hands the phone to Bob, and he calls a friend of his who is into the occult and well versed and educated in it, and as we are driving, he is describing what happened to the lady. Bob later told me his friend told him she believed it was the children of Hecate or something like that. I have no idea about what Hecate is, but it sounded like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, me and the 2 other people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time, and they told me later that just like me, the hair on the back of their neck stood up as a loud snapping noise came from the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stopped dead in its tracks and would no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that a tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking to on the phone lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and they said they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke, and after about 3 minutes, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, and we all unloaded out of the car and stood in front of it, waiting for the vehicle to hopefully stop. Now I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me I am correct, and the vehicle doesn't stop. As it comes into view, it is a beat-up old pickup truck, and it slows down. In the truck are 2 men in their 30s-40s with huge beards, who stare at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob, and before I can speak, he says what I was already thinking: "The guy's in the boat." Before I can say anything back, we see headlights coming from the direction the truck that passed by just went, and we went still and quiet as the same guys in the same truck passed by slowly again, staring at us on the side of the road. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get here now. And hung up. 4 or 5 minutes go by, and we see headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff ready, thinking it is Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and is going to be about 10 to 15 more minutes before she gets there. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror, as do I, as the same truck slowly passes by again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck, this time though the driver slows to a crawl and says, "Looks like you fellers could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and me that we were definitely dealing with the boat guys, but where the hell did the other guy go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to the boatman was immediately reminded to us as we begin to hear the laughter again off in the distance, but all around us like before, and over the next few minutes it started getting closer and closer. I am almost pissing my pants as the sound is getting deafening and we have nowhere to run this time, and then from behind our car off in the distance we see 2 sets of headlights come on and 2 vehicles coming towards us slowly side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road, both coming our way. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road we are stuck on, and the laughter seems to be zeroing in on us as if hundreds or thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There is no wind, no sound other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road of the 2 vehicles slowly driving towards us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatman, we are given a reprieve, as at this time coming from the other direction we see another set of headlights coming fast. We hold our breath. The laughter, the boatman, what could be next, how will we get out of this? And that is when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up and it is Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car and rolls her windows down and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God. You weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screams at us to get in, and we do. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around. And no sooner than she starts to drive away, the 2 sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they are about a car length behind the car we are all crammed in. I yell to the driver, "Go go go." Channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum and telling her faster must go faster, she floors it, and for about a mile the 2 vehicles stay on our ass, then they turn off onto a side road. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter still way off in the distance with our windows down, then after 3 miles the laughter was gone. To this day I have no explanation to what happened, what the laughing children were, why the laughing followed us, If the boatmen were connected to all this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence that happened to terrify us at the same time as the paranormal stuff was happening. And if that is the case, why did they not react to the laughing children sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I have had constant chills and goosebumps as I have written this. I am sorry for typos or grammar issues, but I am a bit shaky as well. I am going to share this story as is. I hope it is readable, and I hope somebody who reads this and has had a similar experience can share their story with me. In a weird way, I believe that would help me deal with the trauma this experience still causes me to this day. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You can think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how powerful or mundane the paranormal could be. If you use the paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly sociopathic hillbillies. And laughing children. I hope everyone who listens to this sleeps well, but I know that after telling my story like this, for at least the next few nights I will be getting no sleep at all.